Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started here. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. A couple of beginning things. We are going to be recording this entire presentation, the audio and the video. We will put this up on the ARB hydrogen infrastructure page, as we have with the previous webinars. So all of that will be available for your reference in the future. We will also be posting the slides as a PDF, and we'll post the attendee list, all of that sometime within the next week or so. And we'll send out a listserv announcement through the same email listserv that you got the invitation for this webinar from. So first of all, thank you all for attending this webinar. We're going to have everybody in listen-only mode. If you want to ask a question, we ask that you either use the raise your hand button or actually type your question into the questions window. We'll probably play it by ear in terms of taking individual questions as they come, or waiting for a group of questions to start answering and take some breaks in between, especially since this is a nice long 4-hour webinar. So I'm Andrew Martinez, Air Resources Engineer at ARB. We'll also have presentations from Jane Berner of the California Energy Commission in the later half of this webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and get started though. Today, what we're really going to cover, spend a good amount of time covering, is the California Hydrogen Infrastructure Tool. This is really an update webinar, so for those of you who may not be totally familiar, this tool was developed and released to the public first in 2015. Over the last 2 years, we've had a lot of changes occur, and so this really is kind of an update on what has happened in that time, how we're using the tool now, and how we look to use the tool potentially in the future. So for the first half of this webinar, we're really going to review those updates. Going to recap the 2015 version of CHIT, just so that everybody on the webinar has a base understanding of what the tool is and what the tool does. If you are interested, there's a lot more information about CHIT, about its base development. There was a webinar in 2015 that covered the formulation of it, some very broad GIS fundamentals, and that's still available on CARB's website. We're going to then move straight into the particular changes that have occurred this year. On the slide, you can see a list of all of those different portions that we're going to cover today. And so it goes everything from the simulated traffic data, which we actually had covered in a webinar back in March, to new data inputs, new capabilities, new functions, functions that have been developed for the GFO process, functions that have been developed in response to stakeholder input and public input, and then just some regular updates and fine-tuning and streamlining of the tools themselves. So the goals today are really to provide the answers to everybody to questions like, what are the new features? What are the new data inputs available with this 2017 release? How are they developed? What are the new default settings? What data inputs have been updated? What new operations are available? And what's the current plan for ongoing development and use? So we'll start with a review of the 2015 version of CHIT, just to make sure everybody's on the same page of where we were before this year. So CHIT is part of two tools that the ARB uses and developed in-house called CHIT and CHAT. These are tools that help us really accomplish our requirements under Assembly Bill 8, which actually provides the funding and the program structure for funding of hydrogen infrastructure in the state of California. Within AB8, there are reporting requirements and analysis requirements for ARB to look at the existing funded and open hydrogen stations, look at plans for fuel cell electric vehicle deployment throughout the state, and make assessments of where the needs are for new hydrogen infrastructure investments. That includes coverage assessments and capacity assessments. And we report on these every year in the annual evaluations, which are shown in the middle of this figure. And so CHIT is itself one of the two tools that are really critical in being able to develop our recommendations and our assessments. We publish this report annually, but its purpose really is to provide recommendations to the California Energy Commission as they work on developing their hydrogen solicitations. And so essentially the process that, as we envision here, is that the analysis is completed through CHIT and CHAT. It's reported out through the June annual evaluations, and then it's incorporated through cooperation and collaboration with the Energy Commission into the development of their infrastructure solicitations. And so the core of CHIT is that it is a geographical information system tool that's really used to plan infrastructure placement appropriately for upcoming fuel cell electric vehicle releases and launches. And its process is really in three parts. The first is to identify a market. So essentially, the tool takes in demographic information and other indicators to find out where the likely fuel cell electric vehicle adopter market is and make an assessment of geographically and spatially how strong that likely adopter market is across the entire state. It then evaluates the current infrastructure. So it looks at how many stations are there in the state, where are they, what kind of coverage are they providing to the different neighborhoods, to the different markets. Are they starting to provide necessary amounts of redundant coverage and overlapping coverage, or are they still too spread out? And then it works to prioritize the uncovered market from year to year. So you look at what's available, what's already been funded in 1 year, and you make recommendations through the tool in terms of where the next stations need to be placed. And if they are placed in those areas, then those become known inputs in terms of the existing infrastructure, and you move on to the next high priority areas. And that's kind of the concept of the overarching concept of what CHIT was first meant to do in the context of the ABA program. And a really key part of this entire process is the assessment of coverage. And coverage is essentially the conceptual representation of convenient access to fueling stations. If you think about the gasoline station example, you can think about, I'm sure, at least a handful of stations that you are either near your house or on your typical commute, or that you know of from drives that you make very often. And so that measure of how easy it is for you in your daily life to be able to find fueling available when you need it is essentially what this coverage is meant to measure. It's often discussed in terms of drive time. So essentially, a coverage might be provided to all neighborhoods within a 15-minute drive of a station, right? For example, and it can be conceptualized either as yes, a neighborhood has coverage, or no, it doesn't, or it could be assessed in terms of degrees of coverage. So, for example, a neighborhood that is 1 minute away from a station might be determined to have more coverage, more convenient access to hydrogen fueling than a neighborhood that is 15 minutes away from a station. And a neighborhood that is within 5 minutes of 2 stations might have more coverage and more access than a neighborhood that's within 5 minutes of only 1 station. And the whole goal here is that well-planned coverage increases consumer confidence and the likelihood of adoption of fuel cell electric vehicles. So within CHIT, the tool does actually perform assessments of coverage that are along the lines of the degrees of coverage provided. So this is more informative than a yes-no sort of evaluation. It allows us to look at overlapping coverage provided by multiple stations and to determine whether or not that coverage provided by the multiple stations is sufficient for the strength of the potential first adopter market for fuel cell electric vehicles in various neighborhoods. So over here on the left, you can see a map of the relative coverage provided by several stations in the Bay Area. This is straight out of the 2017 annual evaluation. And you can see how, particularly in the southern part of the Bay Area near Campbell and Saratoga, that bright red is coming through because there are 3 stations that essentially provide coverage very close to each other, and that coverage is overlapping and providing a lot of convenient access for neighborhoods in the area. And the same can be said of kind of the northeast corner of San Francisco itself. Now, in 2015, the assessments of need for new stations, which was termed the coverage gap, was based on only comparing the first adopter market assessment to that coverage evaluation. And a key fundamental principle within CHIT is that the hydrogen fueling stations need to be placed near the home locations of likely first adopters, because then likely first adopters have a higher chance of seeing those stations on their daily routes during their daily life and being able to come to the conclusion that they really could adopt this vehicle. They could switch out a gasoline vehicle for a hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicle and be able to go about their daily lives without worrying about where they will be able to fuel, because they see it often enough, they see it near their home, they know they have that assurance of convenient access to fueling. So in terms of the 2015 version, CHIT took those market evaluations based on demographic indicators in various census tracts and compared that to the coverage assessment and found where the difference is. So where coverage does not appropriately meet or meet to the same degree the market assessment, then that indicates a higher need for a new station. And so we can see in the bottom figure here on the slide that, for example, the area right in the northeast corner of San Francisco back in 2015 was deemed to be a high need area because there was a high market potential, a deep blue in this first adopter market assessment, but essentially no coverage, very light purple in the coverage assessment. And another key aspect here is that CHIT is a relative assessment. So wherever the need for or the market evaluation is higher than other areas in the state, that would indicate a higher need. And wherever the coverage assessment is higher than other areas in the state, that would actually indicate a lower need for a new station. And so where that mismatch occurs is where the greatest need for a new station is. Now, the market assessment is accomplished by looking at a number of indicators, demographic indicators, and vehicle adoption indicators that are combined to come up with the full market assessment. These are all taken as weighted indicators for the likelihood of vehicle adoption, and then put together to come up with a single final number for the market estimate. So the first are financial indicators. These include income, these include MSRP of vehicles sold, and these also include luxury vehicle brand adoption in various parts of the state. The next set are education level indicators. So this includes higher degree attainment throughout the state. Green vehicle adoption rates, we'll discuss this a little bit more later, but this is hybrid vehicles and plug-in hybrid vehicles in particular, their adoption rates, and their adoption rates within the first adopter period of their deployments. And then other vehicle trends from the DMV. And so you can sort of conceptualize that we take all of these, we overlay them, and we overlay them with each of them having a different weight, and we come up with a final market assessment. And so that market assessment is one half of what we call the heat or the coverage gap. And so in CHIT, the coverage gap or this heat map is assessed as the coverage times the market evaluation. You can see here, these are the equations where the market evaluation back in 2015 was 50% weighted towards these financial parameters, 30% weighted towards the green vehicle adoption, and 20% weighted towards the educational attainment level. And so this was the map back in 2015 for essentially where new stations would be preferable according to a coverage evaluation. And all of this is accomplished in CHIT, which is built in the ArcGIS environment. It's essentially a set of custom tools through Model Builder. There now are some Python steps, and there are some other steps outside of the ArcGIS environment that can be taken, but for the most part, it's a set of custom tools built in ArcGIS Model Builder. There are some steps that are iterative. There are some steps that are nested. And in general, it relies a lot on spatial analysis, on spatial overlays, on spatial aggregations of information. And so it's really important for those of you who actually want to run this tool to take a look at the CHIT User's Guide, to understand the CHIT User's Guide, follow it, especially for your first 1 or 2 times to make sure you understand the baseline usage of it. However, for those who are more advanced, these tools are available. The full tools are editable. You can provide your own informational inputs, or you can actually, if you want, change the logic within the tools as well. ARB provides the tools and the input data and the output data for the annual evaluation that corresponds to the year that CHIT was released. So when we first released CHIT, the 2015 version of that includes all the information, all the outputs, all the tools from our 2015 annual evaluation. And this year, the 2017 download includes all of that that matches the 2017 annual evaluation. I have a question on some inputs. Michael Penna asked, are you calibrating actual sales to the parameters of market potential? The coefficients you seem to be rather round numbers. Yeah, so that was, there has been an ongoing discussion about how to incorporate, how to essentially tune this to the actual sales that are going on. We'll discuss a little bit more about that later on. You're right, these were pretty round numbers. We did tune these based on what we were seeing in other literature, but absolutely, we are now, right now at this point, and we'll discuss this a little bit, we're looking at how CHIT will evolve in the future away from being something where you're trying to project out and make a prognostication of where fuel cell electric vehicle sales might be. And at some point, you're going to have enough vehicles to actually need to fill in the gaps where vehicles are and where they're not having enough fuel availability or having enough convenient access to fuel. At the time that CHIT was developed, there were all of, I think, 100 vehicles on the road. So it wasn't really a data set that we could actually work with to complete that kind of tuning. And now there are about 2,700 vehicles on the road, according to the California Fuel Cell Partnership. So there could be more enough now, but right now we are looking at ways of eventually kind of moving the tool to follow more the actual on-the-ground reality than a projection of where vehicles might be placed in the future. Okay, next slide. So there are a set of guiding principles that were utilized in the development of CHIT. It is a tool that, as you can see, we use year after year. It's used for planning and reporting purposes, and it's very important to recognize that this is a state tool. It's a state tool that now also is utilized in grant solicitation funding. And so there are a set of concepts that come along with that in addition to just the technical principles. So CHIT is a relative assessment. It is a statewide assessment. It provides an estimation at any point within the state. It is built in particular for the first adopter market. That's part of the inputs that we use. That's kind of fundamental to some of the demographic choices, information choices we've made. As I've mentioned, the actual input data can be changed. So if you have, as a user, have other ideas or other information sources, you can use other data to look at potentially different types of markets. The fuel cell electric vehicle market can be estimated by the relative distribution of multiple demographic indicators. So basically, information about income, about education, those are good stand-ins for where a vehicle might be placed in the absence of any information about actual placement. Accurate assessment of coverage depends on detailed roadway data. I didn't present a lot about this in the previous slides, but if you look back at the 2015 webinar, there was a lot of discussion about what we call Tiger ITN. It's our roadway data set that we developed here in cooperation with some of our colleagues at ARB that provides a much more detailed and a much more accurate assessment of vehicle travel speeds on all the different levels of roadways than has been used in other works in the past. That really helped us get a reliable and a reliable set of information to estimate the drive times around the extent of drive times around different stations. Principle 6 is really the key here. It's that coverage matches the market when it provides convenient fueling access near the fuel cell electric vehicle drivers' homes. Again, this is actually kind of tied to number 3. As we get to a phase where we get out of the first adopter market, it might not be quite as important to essentially convince people that they can go about their daily lives by seeing a station near their home. It might shift more towards seeing a station on their daily commute or seeing a station on the way to places that they go to often for vacations. These are all already kind of key ideas, but really CHIT is tuned finely to what number 6 says. And principle number 7 is CHIT must be a tool that can be shared with the public. That means that all of our data inputs are actually public data. It's essentially in the data download available from ARB. It's been tailored down and cleaned up for public consumption, but it all comes from sources like the U.S. Census Bureau and the Department of Motor Vehicles in California. All right, so that was kind of CHIT in 2015. And so 2017, we now have a lot of new stuff. We have some unreleased tools. We have new tools that we developed to support the GFO process for GFO 15605, new tools developed based on stakeholder impact, and new tools that we developed for our 2017 annual evaluation, and then some process improvements and cleanups. So next, hit one. So these are all of the completely new tools. You can see that some of these will be really helpful, like the add station and reevaluate. That's actually one that we created for GFO 15605 to quickly enable the kind of network effect, assessing the network effect of selected hydrogen station awards. The new generate heat map versions, we'll talk about those later. Those add in more data inputs that weren't available in 2015. The local capacity estimation, the data for that has been published previously through the online web map viewer, but now we're finally making the tool available for automating that process. And the retune coverage gap is kind of a usability thing. Hit one more. These are the tools that have been updated that are not backwards compatible. So there are some updates in here that are completely different from the 2015 version. You can't really use it with the same data. You can't really use it in the same order. So these are ones that if you're going to try to compare between 2015 and 2017, you have to be really careful about which version you're using. And then one more. And these are the tools that have been updated and are backwards compatible. Most of the updates really are to try to make it faster, to try to make it more user-friendly, make it more easily able for a new user to follow and replicate the process that we went through in the 2017 annual evaluation. And as you can see, basically, no tool has been untouched. We have a question is there any interest from government fleets, transit fleets, or utilities in adding to the hydrogen fleet of vehicles? If there is, this will influence your CHIT model. So, yeah, we have been developing CHIT in terms of the private owner's experience, the private owner's light duty experience. Absolutely that the government fleets and transit fleets for light duty can have an effect at the end of the day. There are other ways that the GFO process, the solicitation process, addresses that. But typically the solicitations are meant for primarily for vehicle fueling of privately owned light duty passenger vehicles. So that's kind of what the CHIT tool focuses on in trying to make its recommendations. I believe some of the slides later might talk about these fleet applications. Oh, and we have one more question. Will future funding be determined on the CHIT model determining the most needed area? So that's not known at this time. I can't speak for the Energy Commission in terms of what their next solicitation will be, and I believe actually the Energy Commission is also does not have that answer yet. There will be a series of solicitation workshops coming up through this month and I think into next month. So that would be a great venue to have that discussion. But it was used in 15605, so that's why I do provide some of these examples here, just so you can see what the process is or has been. And so just a word of caution again to new users or users who have used the 2015 version and want to use the 2017 version. The base input data has been changed in some cases. There's new functionality that is available through how you set some of the variables in the 2017 version, so definitely refer to the user's guide. The user's guide is provided with the full download on ARB's Hydrogen Infrastructure Assessments page. And then there are new data options. So like you can see here, this is a generate heat map with 2017 options. That has every data input that we've added as possible to be possibly included in evaluation of coverage gap. So you can add in traffic intensity and auto manufacturer survey responses and registered fuel cell electric vehicle deployments. If you be mindful of which ones are and are not backwards compatible, this is the same tool in 2015 and 2017 version. You can see that not only are there different steps, but even some steps that are essentially performing the same function have different underlying coding. And so unless you're really familiar with ArcGIS and with Model Builder, I would definitely recommend sticking to the process as outlined in the user's guide. But if you are comfortable with working across different versions and with different input data and trying to work with these models and their logic, you're definitely welcome to it. And if you have any observations and feedback, we would definitely be interested in hearing it. And finally, the last change in terms of really basic changes to the structure and function of CHIT is that in 2015, we had two different geodatabases. We've consolidated that down to one. There's new data because there's new inputs that we include as optional inputs to some of the processes, and we've simplified the naming convention. In 2015, a lot of the names didn't really make much sense to anybody except CARB employees, so the naming convention is a little bit more intuitive now for choosing layers and being able to replicate the 2017 annual evaluation. Okay, so it's kind of the overview of CHIT as a tool itself. We're going to now move into the specifics of what has changed since 2015. So we'll first start with the simulated traffic intensity. I'm going to kind of cover this briefly because we did have a webinar back in March of this year that covered the development of this data, that covered concepts for how we might integrate it, and actually led to some of the final decisions and how we utilized it in the 2017 annual evaluation. So adding traffic intensity data came out of the question from the public and other stakeholders about, well, CHIT has been defined to try to place stations near first adopters' homes or where you think the first adopters' homes are likely to be, but what about where people drive? Isn't it important to have stations along people's commutes as well? We'll actually look at that later, that question, but we went ahead and we tried to work on figuring out a way to add that in. In 2015, we had actually looked at that concept, but didn't have good traffic volume information. We didn't have a consistent data set that could be equally applied across the state, which of course violated one of the other principles for the tool. So what we intended to do instead was to simulate traffic data to be able to look at simulated traffic volume and apply it. Now, this does change a couple of things in CHIT. So coverage matches the market not only when it provides convenient fueling access near drivers' homes, but also when it's within proximity to commonly traveled routes. So that kind of changes principle number 6. And then principle number 4 also changed because we're still maintaining that the identification of the fuel cell vehicle owner market can be estimated by those demographic indicators, but the total fueling market is actually the owner market and the commonly traveled routes together. And that's really what you want to target. You want to be able to target where are people likely to fuel. So that changes the overall picture of the process. We just recently saw a picture like this for the 2015 version. The 2017 version now has, again, that market assessment, but then it also adds in the commuter traffic assessment. So where those are high, that means you're going to have a high coverage gap and you're going to want to put in a new station. But then where you already have existing coverage, that then decreases your need. So you can see that the two, market assessment and commuter traffic, are kind of additive towards coverage gap, whereas the existing coverage is kind of subtractive. And now we actually also have, in addition to the coverage, we have the capacity need as an available tool through CHIT. We had originally used it as kind of an outside capability, but now we've automated it and brought it into the CHIT toolbox. So the idea of simulating the traffic data came from essentially the assumption that if you have a sufficiently detailed street geometry and travel speed, which we do through ITN Tiger, and you essentially know where people drive from and to on their commutes, you might be able to actually simulate all the commutes of people within the state. However, that requires an elevated level of scrutiny because it's not observational data. It is by its nature going to be some kind of optimization scheme based on some function, and that is not going to necessarily be the routes that people really do drive every day. However, back in October 2015, there was a major lead to look at the origin destination employment statistics data set, which I believe is also from the US Census Bureau. And what we were able to do with that is basically simulate all those entries. And the entries in that data set are the census block of where the respondent's home is, and the census block where their workplace is. And so what we were able to do was to put those into, essentially geocode those as XY coordinates into ArcGIS, and then ask ArcGIS network analysts to simulate what their likely path might be between work and home during the PM peak commute time. We chose PM peak because that's a little bit slower than the AM peak, which means that you have a little bit more restrictions in terms of what's determined to be convenient access. There were basically 7.6 million records that represented about 8.4 million commutes across the state. And in order to be able to do this, we had to kind of write some ArcPy code and execute this across 10 processors on 2 computers. It took about 6 months to actually simulate just the individual routes themselves, which then created 760 files. And then we took those routes and we looked at all the routes that were less than 2 hours of a drive. We just considered that as a reasonable cutoff for what might actually be a real commute. And then we counted up the number of people driving on each and aggregated that data into our evaluation grid. We'll talk about that later. So you can see that here, for example, these are 10,000 commutes. We'll look just at the Bay Area to Sacramento area, and if we select the subset, those are all the commutes that are less than or equal to 2 hours. And so basically what we do is we overlay our evaluation grid that we use throughout the CHIT processes and then add up how many people are traveling through each evaluation grid according to these routes. Back in March, we talked about the results of this data. So that's of this process. So that's the figures that are on the upper half of this slide. We presented those, and back in March, we had the input that perhaps one adjustment that might need to be made is we might need to weight each of the routes according to the likelihood that that route is taken by a fuel cell electric vehicle first adopter. So the raw data itself, the unweighted data, is basically every driver. But if we really want to try and have a factor that represents the driving patterns of fuel cell electric vehicle adopters, one way we could possibly estimate that is to look at the home point and basically weight each route by the market potential of the home point on each route. And so we went ahead and did that, and you can see that that's in the bottom half here, and there are spatial differences actually in the intensity and of the traffic that's traveled by these that's traveled when you weight it by the market evaluation. Now, what this is not saying is that these definitely are the travel paths of the first adopters versus the not first adopters. This is just saying that we have simulated travel paths and we have simulated likelihood of first adopters for fuel cell electric vehicles. And so this is kind of, you can envision this sort of as a likelihood or a probability that this is the route that the first adopters might drive. Both of these data sets are actually available in CHIT 2017 for user implementation. In the annual evaluation, we did go ahead and use the weighted traffic data set. Next slide. So just to really be clear about this, we presented this back in March, but the simulated traffic data set does provide detailed information. It's based on speed data at fine resolution. It's important to realize that all optimized travel routes for the simulated commuters. It does represent a reasonably sized sample of the full labor force. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates there are about 17.6 million people in California, whereas the data set we were able to simulate about 8 million people's drives. This is really only an estimate of what the commuter traffic intensity might be. It is, however, a unified estimate that's similarly developed for all areas in the state. That's actually difficult to achieve regularly. Throughout the state, there are a number of different organizations that do different planning and keep track of these data in different ways. So that was part of our early difficulty in being able to implement something like this. And it does provide an estimate of traffic volume that is self-consistent with the traffic speeds that are already implemented in other ways through the CHIT tool. What it does not provide, however, is it's not observed actual routes of commuters. It's all a simulation. It does not provide the full commuter travel pattern. In particular, we did not make any assumptions about occupational vehicles, medium duty, heavy duty vehicles, or how those vehicles' travel patterns might impact the light duty vehicles' travel patterns. We also were essentially assuming that every pair of home and work destination was going to be driven. The data set does not say whether or not these people actually drive to their work location. They may take other modes of transportation. So we do not have any information about that. And this does not really have any indication of the travel routes specifically utilized by first adopters. It's just that the likelihood, it's just sort of an estimate of the probability that the travel route is from a first adopter. And due to the limitations of spatial resolution on the census tract level, it's not really an exact door-to-door evaluation. So in CHIT 2017, these data can actually be implemented through two of the tools, the two new generate heat map tools, so either one with just traffic or the full one that allows all of the new data implementation. We separated out the one that just lets you add traffic in case there are users who only want to consider that new piece of information and not the others, because adding the others in does take processing time. It does take time to overlap or overlay different information layers and aggregate them within the evaluation cells. So we provided this one separated out just in case it doesn't, just in case there are users who only want to look at that new input. And then in terms of how it's implemented in a coverage gap evaluation, in the 2017 annual evaluation, we actually did retune some things. So here you can see that we left market weightings alone. We left the financial weights alone. However, we'll discuss this a little bit later. Some of the coverage we re-tuned, and then here we said that essentially instead of just wanting to match the coverage to the market in the heat equation, you're trying to match the coverage to the market and the traffic, and that's kind of in a 4-to-1 split. That is a rough split. It is based more on observation of what we think is more important than the other, but that is actually informed by some clean vehicle rebate project survey that will data that we'll look at later on in this presentation. Next slide. So for more information, actually, there's a lot more information available on this traffic data. I really highly encourage you to visit this website. This is our hydrogen infrastructure assessments page. This is where actually also the downloads for the CHIT tool are located. This is where the map viewers, the online map viewers are located. And you can see this March 2017 CHIT traffic data webinar. That's where, those are all the links for all the information from that webinar. So I think that's, can you go next slide? Yeah, so this is a good spot to take a few more questions. We've had a few come in during that section. Okay, so one person had asked that they saw hybrid electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids as one input to CHIT, but did not see BEVs. Is it in there too? Actually, so this is part of the fundamentals of some of the fundamental assumptions in CHIT. We've found that actually fuel cell electric vehicle adopters and BEV adopters may not really be the same people, and part of that is the difference in the fueling experience. As you can imagine, a hybrid electric driver, a plug-in hybrid electric driver, they can drive out with an electrified drivetrain without having to change any of their fueling patterns at all. And that's more similar to the goal, the eventual goal of the fuel cell electric vehicle than the battery electric vehicle, where the actual fueling experience is quite different. You might be able to plug in at home, or you plug in during the day. You don't necessarily visit a station and visit that station and refuel in 5 minutes or less and drive off, right? So it's a very different type of experience. And so we found that it's not really appropriate to include them as include BEV adoption as an indicator for fuel cell electric vehicle adoption, but that hybrid and plug-in hybrid might be more appropriate on their own than including the BEV with those two. And again, we've kind of seen this come to fruition through some of the clean vehicle rebate project data, which we'll cover later in this webinar. We also asked how the simulation results compare to raw traffic volumes. So again, that's very difficult to find good data on the raw traffic volumes, especially observational. I would again refer you to that March 2015 or March 2017 webinar and or just the slides from that. We covered that in that webinar. Brief rundown is that it actually looks pretty good. There's not a lot of data available on the lower grade roads, so basically on your local roads. Most of the data available is from observation is on highways, and on highways it looks pretty good in most cases. There are some cases where there was a bit of a mismatch, and it seemed to vary regionally. It seemed to be, I think from that webinar we discussed how the mismatch was a little bit greater in the Bay Area than it was in the Los Angeles area, but overall it seemed pretty good. That's why we decided to go ahead and utilize it. So I again recommend, if you want more information, to go to that March 2015 or 2017 webinar, the information on our website. And then, why weren't travel patterns of occupational, medium duty, and heavy duty vehicles included in the travel patterns data? The short answer is we don't have the information available. The data set that we utilized was part of the US Census, so it's just an addition to that, and respondents to that are allowed to, if they want, or have the opportunity if they want, to provide their home location and their work location. And that is literally the only data source that we have. That's the only information that we had from the data source. It does not include any information about these occupational vehicles, and we don't really have a way right now to model their likely travel patterns accurately or with enough confidence. Again, that March webinar did discuss kind of a lot of our caveats in terms of the confidence of the data and what we really decided to include because it could be verified versus couldn't. And finally, there's a question of, is the model predictive of needs for connector stations, and does it cover long distance trips? So that is actually one thing that CHIT cannot do. CHIT cannot provide assessment of the needs for connector and travel, vacation destination type of stations. Again, that's part of the principles. The principles are looking at trying to get those stations where first adopters need to see them in their daily lives to be able to make that decision to adopt first adopter intenders would be able to make that decision to actually purchase a fuel cell electric vehicle. So we do not actually have the capability in the tool to look at those types of stations. Okay, I'll try and keep the microphone a lot closer to my, just in case I'm seeing some questions about the audio cutting out intermittently. And then for the November 8th, 2017 NOPA Station Awards, did CEC and ARB use the CHIT 2015 or the 2017 model? We used the 2015. That was the one that had been developed at the time and was available at the time of the applicants submitting their applications. So we didn't switch over in the middle of that process to change the evaluation. As you might be aware, there was the online map viewer that had data from the output of CHIT 2015 that was shown to be the base input data for the solicitation process. So once that had gotten started, there really wasn't an opportunity to switch that up and still keep a consistent and equitable evaluation amongst all applicants. So that one did use the 2015 data. I would mention that the input data themselves haven't changed things a ton. The biggest impacts have come from the new coverage provided by the new stations that were actually awarded through 15605, both the November 8th and the February NOPA, and that some of the retuning has changed a little bit of the coverage gap in some areas, but it hasn't had nearly as much of an effect as the new stations coverage has. So, all right, we'll go into the next section on the auto manufacturer survey and DMV data. So this is where we start getting into where we were looking towards. CHIT has been so far used as a tool to analyze forecasted needs for hydrogen fueling. It's a tool that's really meant to try and help us decide where we're going to need stations with the lack of any information about really where real fuel cell vehicle adopters actually do live. It was a little bit of a predictive model because at the time there were no fuel cell vehicle adopters on the road, at least to a large enough degree to be able to use them as a significant input. So there was no empirical data previously available other than case-by-case and anecdotal information, and we wanted something that we could utilize in a mechanistic way and a methodical way to provide an evaluation that was equivalently arrived at across the entire state. And so we came up with a process where we utilized those demographic data indicators to be able to kind of make an assessment of a forecast where fuel cell electric vehicle adopters might live. As we go forward, obviously, vehicles are going to be actually adopted at an increasing rate. There's going to be more vehicles on the road. As I mentioned, we now have at least 2,700 on the road, more than that, because I think that estimate is about a month old at this point. And so we're going to need to be able to look at not only trying to forecast where vehicles might be placed in the future, but looking at where vehicles really are being placed right now and where there still might be some bit of a gap. Because as with essentially any modeling venture or any predictive venture, it's not going to be 100% correct. So at some point, we're going to be looking towards sort of transitioning this tool away from this predictive measure towards something that's going to be following the actual observed patterns of deployed vehicles and their needs. So for that, we've decided to be able to right now begin integrating DMV registration data. So we have included that this year in our 2017 annual evaluation. We implemented it in the actual assessments and the results that you see in that annual evaluation. But we have, since we're still really early in the first adopter phase, given it a very small weighting. We'll show that in a second. In addition, the forecasting provided through CHIT, through the demographic indicators, they have the benefit of being an open public data set for trying to assess the market potential across the state. However, it really is still kind of a limited data set. It's looking at only certain factors. It's only looking at certain features that can essentially provide the estimate of where the adopter market might be. There are a lot of considerations in the real world that can't come into play into CHIT, especially, again, because we want it to be a tool that can be used sort of as this baseline equivalent assessment across the state. There might be other features and other considerations that are highly localized and we can't really find the data in other areas across the state to actually be able to quantify it and include it in the tool. And so there might be other information available that could show a different forecast for where fuel cell electric vehicle adopters might actually be located when you have more highly localized data. And one of those potential sources is auto manufacturer data that comes to us through the surveys that we administer annually under the ABA program. And so this is kind of a second independent assessment of where fuel cell electric vehicle first adopters might be, or where essentially the intender market might live. And so we looked at being able to take that information and actually include it in the CHIT evaluations as well. So we have since 2014 always actually reported out these data, but we've never really included them as a factor in CHIT evaluations until this year. We did not actually use it this year yet in our annual evaluation, the capabilities in there in CHIT 2017. We didn't use it because right now our, well, we'll get to that in the next slide, or next two slides. So next one. Oh, shoot. Wrapping up. Yeah, can you maybe unmute people? Attendees. Maybe not. Maybe oh, Steve's not on now. Go up. Oh, maybe I wouldn't unmute everybody. No, not everybody. But he's not on the phone. Keep going. If you see Mike Pennev, yeah, can you unmute Mike? So Mike Pennev, I have you unmuted. Can you hear me? Busy signal. Oh, Mike. Okay. Okay. So we're hearing that some people are having problems with the audio, but others aren't. Mike, I see your comment. Were you able to hear everything about the DMV and auto manufacturer so far? Okay. So Steve, if you're on, I'm not sure what happened to your line. It seems like the webinar is still going okay, so we're going to continue. So next slide, please. Okay, so for the DMV registration data, basically this is taken from April 2017 information that we actually also reported in the 2017 annual evaluation. It is sorry, blanking right now. It is actually normalized to the area of the zip code. So the DMV data that we get is counts of vehicles in each zip code, but of course not every zip code is the same size. So we attempt to normalize to avoid any skewing there. And so that's done through many of the indicators in CHIT. The April data contains 1,609 fuel cell electric vehicles. You can see this kind of the distribution on the left-hand side, where blue is essentially, deep blue is no vehicles. And as you get to higher, to this brighter red, this deeper red, those are higher concentrations of vehicles, basically numbers per square mile. And this was applied to the market evaluation portion as another additive factor, along with things like income and education level, et cetera. Next slide. The auto manufacturer data was based on, again, the April 2017 survey data. The spatial resolution, however, is limited in that survey. It's limited to the county level. So these are not normalized to the area basis. It's just the number that we get there. And then we utilize it, or we envision that this should actually be utilized as a scaling factor. So essentially, it could correct the predictive analysis that we include based on auto manufacturer input. 1 second, Gene. We have a question in the room.
Steve Ellis called in again, and he's good. He hears everything now.
Okay.
That's all I wanted to
say. Okay. All right. Good to have you back with us, Steve. Okay. And then, so we included the ability for this in the CHIT 2017 toolbox. We did not implement it in the annual evaluation. As we discussed in that report, essentially the relative spread of auto manufacturer survey responses amongst the counties is equivalent to the relative intensity of the market evaluation, the predictive market evaluation that we already have, that we actually perform already through CHIT. So we didn't see a need to go ahead and rescale everything, since it was just going to be reinforcing the same evaluation that we already had. So on the next slide, these two data inputs are what really separates the full 2017 options version of the Generate Heat Map tool, that coverage gap determining tool. We implemented, again, the auto manufacturer data implement essentially as a switch, because it's a multiplicative factor is how we're utilizing it. So the next slide. So this is about as complicated as the math gets for CHIT in the 2017 version. So you can see that with this is the equations on the right with all of the optional data available. The weightings are the weightings that we used in the 2017 annual evaluation. They can be changed by users if they want to do their own investigations. And so you can see that we included the DMV registrations with a really low weighting. Only 10% of the market assessment is given to DMV registrations. And that's really just still because there's still so few vehicles. We still need a high weight on the predictive measures versus the actual observed measures. As we go forward in time, we really expect, kind of swapping this eventually, that the predictive measures, which are encapsulated by those first two lines of the market equation, will kind of decrease in the weighting. That 0.9 will go down towards 0.1, and that 0.1 on the DMV registrations, which is observed, will go up towards 0.9 eventually, and possibly 1 and 0. And then here you can see that in the within the pink box in the second portion, where with the second version of the market evaluation, that we utilize the auto manufacturer data, or we envision that the auto manufacturer data would be used kind of as a multiplicative correction factor to the predictive data that we use through CHIT. Next. So can you explain the questions? So we also had a question that as the OEMs will provide public responses for target locations, how would CHIT incorporate this information? So yeah, as you may be aware, for those of you in the hydrogen community, in I believe it was June, the California Fuel Cell Partnership Auto Manufacturer Group, Auto OEM Group, published a public letter with identification of station locations or station markets where they collectively saw a need for new hydrogen stations. The information in that has not yet been determined how best that information can be utilized in a tool like CHIT. The letter did include city names and intersections of highways. We're looking now into what is the best method for including that. There were about 40 different locations. As I mentioned before, CHIT is a statewide evaluation. CHIT tries to make a comparable evaluation at any location throughout the state. Those 40 locations are definitely valuable information. It's not yet been determined how we can utilize such a sparse data set in the same manner as we have for our other indicators to provide a statewide assessment incorporating it. We're looking into ways to address that, but that will probably actually require some public comment, some public discussion about the best method to do that, and also with in that public discussion also, of course, including the auto manufacturers, so that we can really make sure that the method is incorporated, is representative of the intent of the letter, and still provides the type of information that the state would like to see for its evaluations through CHIT. Okay. All right, we'll go ahead and keep going ahead. So, this next tool is really a usability tool. This is a coverage gap retuning tool. So there's a lot of data now, especially if you run all of the, if you want to include all the optional data inputs. And so the generate heat map, or that coverage gap determining tool, can really take a while. Especially as I had mentioned, you have to overlay all of those input data files one on top of another. You have to align, the GIS tool has to align them, it has to aggregate them, take averages, compare them, perform a lot of math. If you haven't yet seen CHIT, the evaluation grid for the state is something like 3.5 million evaluation cells. So you can imagine it takes a while. It actually takes somewhere around 8 hours to perform that calculation. Some users might be interested in sensitivity analyses, looking at the weighting factors. So let's say you don't disagree with any of the input data we've supplied with the CHIT tool, but you think that maybe those weighting factors are a little wonky. They need to be more appropriately specified, and you want to look into that. In the 2015 version, the only thing you could do was rerun that tool and take another 8 hours to recalculate everything, to realign everything, and then recalculate it, when all you really need to do is just do the recalculation. You don't need to realign everything. So what we did is we developed a tool that can make this a lot easier, a lot faster, since for the recalculation, you don't really need to perform that spatial alignment again. And so this tool can now perform that function in a really short time. So essentially, it's the retune coverage gap tool. Some notes for the usage of this is that you give it essentially a base coverage gap, and then you tell it all of the new weighting factors. But one requirement is that base coverage gap has to be generated from the version that actually has all of the data inputs in it, the 2017 options. In addition, there's a parameter called the no coverage value that basically says how much more do you want a station in a location that has 0 coverage versus a station that has any other coverage. This is part of an earlier tool in the process, and that is defined relative to the value that was put in the first time you generated that heat map. So basically, this one input is the only one that's not absolute. It's relative to the previous solution. And this tool modifies the base coverage map file. It does not create a new file. So users who utilize this tool and want that original file should definitely back up that original one before they run this tool, and then run this on that new one. So I'm going to run through a quick example, I think, in the next slide. Yeah, so or just show one. So in this top figure, this is directly from the 2017 annual evaluation. This is kind of the West LA region. Pacific Palisades is kind of this elbow in the map. And the color shading is the coverage gap. Deep blue is very low coverage gap. You don't want very low desirability for a new station. Bright red is very high desirability for a new station. All the white dots are the locations of existing stations. And you can kind of see areas around the white dots in some of them where you can see the borders of the 15-minute coverage provided by those stations kind of outlined by some harder changes in the colors of the lines. And if we rerun this tool and we say that we want to quadruple the desirability of a station outside of any coverage compared to what we did in this top one, we come out with this figure in the bottom. And you can see that, you know, around the stations, the white dots, you can see that all of the colors have come down. They've come to the cooler colors. You can see that the bright reds have come down to orange and yellows. Even the orange and yellows came down to the greens, and the greens came down to the blues. And you can really more clearly see the demarcations of where coverage is provided by these stations that are existing versus the stations where there is no coverage provided by them. And so this is one way you can use this tool. You can also use this tool to, like I said, if you think that our financial parameter being weighted 50% of the market is too high, it really should be only 25%, and adjust all the other weightings appropriately, you do that as well through this tool. So if you go to the next slide, and really the advantage here is that this process took all of 11 and a half minutes to run versus 8 hours to do all the spatial aligning that really isn't necessary when you want to just do one of these retuning processes. So this isn't necessarily a new calculation in CHIT. This isn't necessarily a new output of the process, but we're providing it to users, to the general public, in case there is anybody out there who is actually using the tool for some research needs. We are aware of some efforts going on, and we just thought this might be a nice capability to add in. And then the next new capability that's kind of a usability issue is also the single station reevaluation. We really developed this for GFO 15605, so really this was first for our own use. Basically, 15605 was the first solicitation through the Energy Commission that looked at the network effect of each proposed award. So essentially, essentially the first station was selected, and then its effect on the network, its effect on location values and capacity needs around it was reevaluated through CHIT, and then that information was reconsidered by the scoring group, and then on, and that iterative process continued so that we made sure we weren't essentially clustering stations too much where they didn't need to be clustered, and that we were actually taking into account what the new network would look like with each selection of stations. And so that process, again, doesn't really require recalculating everything, spatially aligning everything. Every grid cell has all the information you really need just to adjust the new evaluation of coverage. And it's really only adjusting the new evaluation of coverage in the local area around that new station. So again, same concept here. To perform this adjustment of the data and perform this adjustment of the output, you don't really need to go through the full 8 hour, you shouldn't need to go through the full 8 hour process, realigning all the data, re-aggregating all the data just to make one small change. So this tool, again, takes advantage of the fact that all the data is there, and also takes advantage of the fact that you're really only making the most changes in a small limited area, and that you only need to do one process, one calculation across the state to re-normalize everything. So next slide. So again, so this is the Add Station Reevaluate tool. to be able to use this tool, you first do have to do a service area calculation. Depending on your computer, that's a matter of seconds for the 1, 3, 6, 9, 12, and 15-minute service area around your station. And then you can use actually any coverage gap map that's been developed with any version of the Generate Heat Map tool. It does not make any adjustments to the market side. It's really only looking at the coverage side. It's only looking at recalculating coverage. And it doesn't do anything in terms of capacity need. That's a totally separate calculation, a totally separate tool. Again, this is faster than trying to do the full Generate Heat Map tool for a single station. However, which means you can use it iteratively, but it actually is slower after about 15 or so stations because you have to run this one 15 times over versus running that one tool once. Next slide. So an example of this, so this is basically taken from the results of, or from the process of the 15605. So this is the coverage right before the final station, well, final station in February was awarded, which was the 5333 University Drive in Irvine. So this is the evaluation of all the coverage for all the stations that existed before 15605 and every station awarded in 15605 up to that one. Next one. So this is the coverage provided. So that bright red is essentially 1 minute away from that station out to blue, which is 15 minutes away from that station. So next slide. So the pink outline is that 15 minutes. And when it's added in, you can see that it increases the coverage provided locally near that station. You can see that this bluish greenish area right at the center of that has now become an orange, yellow, red area. Next slide. And so similarly, so this is really the heart of it. It's reevaluating the coverage, recalculating that coverage. And then since that's part of the coverage gap, you can see that the coverage gap locally has also decreased. You've gone from a lot of oranges and yellows to some more yellow green. Okay. All right, so the alternative coverage gap formula. This was reported on in the 2017 annual evaluation. We provide capability to use it because we're still looking into that we might reformulate how we calculate coverage gap in the future. But we actually didn't use it in the annual evaluation, or for the annual evaluation. We just reported on the capability, and it's provided in the toolbox. So next slide. Basically, when we were going through the GFO 15605 process, we noted that one of our factors, which was called the potential coverage data factor, which is essentially modified population density, was too heavily weighted. It would allow too many stations to be clustered on a very high scoring area or a very high market value area than really should have been happening. So we performed a sensitivity analysis after 15605 to look at what was causing this. That helped us identify this particular input as really the culprit for this. It used to be given a weighting of half of our coverage calculation, and we found that it needed to be really, really small to not be the controlling factor, to be the most important factor in coverage gap evaluations. We don't necessarily need it not to be the most important factor, but we definitely wanted it to be a lower impact than it really had. So one solution is you just give it a lower weighting. And at the end of the day, that's what we have pursued for the 2017 annual evaluation. But another solution is to rethink about what this really means. This population density was utilized basically in a way that could tell you at any location, if you were to put a station there, how many people would you capture? How many people would that station be able to serve? And so that's why it was included in the coverage portion of the calculation before. Now we think you can also potentially think of this as, instead of potential coverage, it's really a value that tells you what you should scale your market by. Basically, you can assess the strength of the market and then the size of the market, right? And so all the other demographic factors give you the strength of the market. And so this kind of population density is then essentially the size of the market locally. So we looked at what would that mean? How would that change the output if we kind of switched up the kind of the interpretation of what this data point provided. And so here you can see that this essentially moves the potential coverage from on the left back in, well, on the left is essentially the standard version. It moves it from the coverage evaluation into the market evaluation, and it moves it into it as a scaling factor. Again, everything in these parentheses in the market side, that all gives you intensity and likelihood of a fuel cell vehicle adopter market, whereas everything after could be used to assess the size of that market. Next slide. And so this is straight out of the 2017 annual evaluation. And this is what the difference looks like just based on that one change in interpretation of how population density could be used. So basically, on the left is the original equation. On the right is that modified equation where every other input weight has been kept the same between the two. And in the tool, the way to actually implement this is not to run a different tool. It's just to set that access factor, that potential coverage factor's weight to 0. So the logic within the tool is written, within CHIT, is written to notice this, to acknowledge this, and determine which equation to use based on whether it's 0 or a number greater than 0, the weighting for that factor. Again, we didn't utilize this because, as you can see, the hotspots are really limited in this evaluation. We also didn't have a lot of time to do kind of a sensitivity analysis to look at using this formula and re-weighting everything else to try to get something that's more workable. The problem with the very limited hotspots here is that it becomes very difficult to give more general recommendations to the Energy Commission to be able to form grant solicitations out of. The hope is that the grant solicitation process is not too prescriptive. It provides guidance, it provides information to applicants, kind of steers them towards the areas where the likelihood of success might be greater, but still leaves a lot of flexibility to the applicants to find the exact location. And this was just very highly localized in terms of the hotspots. And so we didn't utilize it this time. We're continuing to evaluate this. We're continuing to look into whether or not this will be appropriate in the future to utilize. Next slide. Okay, it's almost 2:30. I'm going to go ahead and take a 10-minute break. So everybody on the phone line, I have 2:23 right now. We'll come back at, we'll just say 2:35. Okay, and we're going to stop the audio for a few minutes. Thank you. Okay, so hello everybody again. We're going to go ahead and get started again since it's 2:35. The next portion that I'm talking about is going to be related to, again, another tool that we developed to help support the GFO 15605 process, and is now been automated to be able to be used by the public in the download version of CHIT. So this is a localized capacity need assessment. So next slide. So again, this was first created to really help with the decision-making process for awarding stations through GFO 15605. The intent is to estimate the localized capacity need for new hydrogen stations based on the CHIT evaluations of the potential first adopter vehicle market and the auto manufacturer survey data. And it does also incorporate the information about the extent of coverage provided by the funded stations. So essentially what it does is it distributes all the vehicles from the annual survey across the evaluation cells in the state, and it uses fairly standard assumptions for daily consumption of hydrogen from fuel cell electric vehicles, and then compares that consumption rate locally to the installed or funded hydrogen station capacity in the same area. And so this provides a localized, continuous value across the state. It's really important to understand that this is, every evaluation cell is, when you see the data, it's essentially kind of like a gradient across the state. You do not need that total amount of capacity in every cell. It's more of a localized consideration, so that two cells next to each other might have the same capacity need because they're really essentially covering the same market. So the total across the state is much larger than the total needed for the number of vehicles. And as a detail, all the rest of the CHIT tools kind of cut off coverage at 15 minutes from a station, but because of an interpolation step that's used in this tool, there's actually kind of spatial variation with distance from stations even outside of that 15 minutes. So we'll show that process. Next slide. So what we're showing here is the evaluation grid in pink. We'll talk a little bit later about its hexagonal evaluation grid. The blue dots are the block group centroids. So the data that we have at each of those blue dots is the number of households. That's part of our population density. It's used in other places throughout the CHIT tool evaluations. And so what we do is we look at, for each of those block groups, we utilize that as essentially a seed point for calculating a need. So we calculate its 15-minute coverage extent. Next. And so we actually calculate that for all of the centroids. And so you can see this is just kind of the South Bay, Torrance South Bay area. And you can see how many there are there. You can imagine how many there are across the state. Next. And what we do is we select all of the grid cells that are actually within a 15-minute drive from any block group, from any population center. And we spread all the vehicles across all of those evaluation cells. What we then do is we look at the market evaluation. Next. And so in each of the evaluation cells, we overlay the market evaluation, and then we collect the number of households that are within each of those evaluation cells. Next. And we come up with essentially a weighted indicator. It's kind of just our indicator for distributing the vehicles. It's 60% weighted towards the market potential and 40% weighted towards essentially the size of the market. And then next, what we do is we take that and we also look at the nearby station coverage. So in this example, go back one. In this example, that highlighted pink block group, within 15 minutes are actually both the Torrance and Long Beach stations. So we say that that block group will actually have, that seed point actually has access to those two stations already. And so what we're basically doing here is we're collecting all of the information we need to say what's the strength of the market near this block group, how many people are there at this point, and so how many vehicles are we likely to have at this point. And we utilize standard assumptions like 0.7 kilograms per day to determine how much hydrogen is going to be needed by the people in that spot, and then also compare that to how much they have available within 15 minutes of their drive. So next slide. Next slide. And so basically, the need is equal to the consumption minus the existing capacity. So at that example spot, in this example, we have that the projected consumption, I believe this is based on the 2023 numbers that we have from the annual survey, is 230 kilograms per day. And because it's located within 15 minutes of the Torrance and Long Beach stations, it already has access to 380 kilograms per day. So in that one particular spot, it has a needed capacity, a capacity need of 0. Now, that does not mean that a station is not necessarily needed at that location. This is just the capacity evaluation of the two related coverage and capacity ideas that are utilized throughout the annual evaluation and throughout the grant solicitation process. But as you can see, what we do is we essentially, all at once, perform the same calculation, the same process for every single block group point across the state. And so we assign that to each one. And so you can see where around this point, all in all the locations in the Torrance South Bay, where there's a higher need for more capacity or a lower need for more capacity. Again, nothing to do with coverage, just capacity. And then what happens is that since this is a sparse data set, we want to be able to make a prediction across the entire state, regardless of the location of the data. We perform an interpolation step to fill in the gaps between the points. There's not really too much concern in terms of this interpolation being misleading, because the actual number of block groups is quite large throughout the state. So this is actually a pretty full data set for the state, geographically speaking. And then basically we perform that interpolation, and here at the bottom you can see that basically you get the continuous variation of capacity need in the area for new hydrogen stations. Within the CHIT 2017 process, this has been divided into 2 steps. This allows tuning of this interpolation step. We do assume a standard interpolation method. It's called inverse distance weighting, but we do want to allow the user, in case they have new input data or new weightings or new information, to have a chance to retune that. The one drawback is that this is one of the capabilities that requires a higher elevation of the license, and it does require an additional extension. So not all users will be able to make use of that additional functionality. However, you don't have to take that retuning step. You can just accept the defaults for step 2, which are based on the tuning from the 2017 annual evaluation. Next slide. So these are the 2 tools. So essentially, step 1 basically does all that assignment, all that collection of the information, all that assignment. It figures out the total need at each spot. And then step 2 performs that kind of interpolation, so it fills in all the gaps between each spot. So as I had mentioned, if you have access to more of the advanced capabilities of ArcGIS, you can retune the parameters that are an input to the second step. But if not, you can just go ahead and utilize the defaults that are provided with the download, because those are the ones that are reflective of the 2017 annual evaluation. Next slide. Again, a series of notes on this. That first step overwrites the input data set, all those points, those block group points that are kind of the seed points for the evaluation, for the calculations. So we provide a template data set, and we recommend you, if you're going to use the tool and you utilize it often or many times, you keep that one template and you keep that as a backup so that you can easily overwrite to generate a new feature set to perform this calculation on. And again, you can't complete step 2 without step 1. And in addition, to kind of help everybody not have to calculate those 15-minute drive times around all of those block points, because there are several thousand of them, we've already calculated that, and we provide that input in CHIT 2017. Now, the tool doesn't necessarily need those exact points to be the basis of the calculation. So users can make their own set of base, seed points for redoing the calculation if they want. But there are certain requirements in the structure of the feature classes that you utilize. There have to be certain fields. There has to be certain matching of some of the data in the fields there between the polygons and those points. So we definitely welcome anybody, encourage anybody who wants to look into those kinds of capabilities to pursue that. There's guidance in the user's guide for how to make sure that if you do create your own custom calculation seed points, that you actually are creating data that can be used by the process, that it won't error out. So we just really highly recommend you take a look at that. And unfortunately, this is the only tool in the entire process that requires some of the general ArcGIS calculation settings to be different from all the others because of one step in it. The CHIT Users Guide goes over that. We definitely encourage you to read over that and make sure that you follow those steps. Next slide. And so this is what it looks like. So again, using similar shading, deep blue is essentially zero capacity need. Bright red is a very high capacity need, up to 760 kilograms per day total. And you can see that what this really allows us to do is it allows us to provide explicitly an evaluation of coverage as a separate factor from capacity need, right? And granted, they are of course related. They are of course based on some of the same input data, but the actual calculations and the actual results are pretty different. The spotty appearance that you see in some areas of the blue, especially of the very dark blue, is a naturally occurring result of the interpolation method, the inverse distance weighted method, and the fact that those are kind of the areas where you're starting to get more and more sparse population centers. Then again, those areas would probably end up being more like destination and connector type stations, which are not the intent of CHIT to be able to evaluate the need for. So, and next slide. And then just a note, in the 2015 version, there was another way to look at need for capacity. And basically it looked at, if you're familiar with the annual evaluations or CHIT itself, there are tools to identify essentially when you look at the coverage gap, once you've calculated that, what are the hot spots? And we call those priority areas. Where is it that high coverage gap is accumulating across the state? In the 2015 version of CHIT, there was a tool provided that allowed you to determine how many stations specifically needed to be put into those priority areas. And that is a little bit different of a calculation than the local capacity need. But we still actually keep that tool here in 2017. That tool is still available. It's essentially what generates the table. If you look in the annual evaluation, it's a table that, or it's the tool that generates in the table that says the priority area and the number of stations required in that area. This is that exact tool that helps us determine the numbers that we present in there. So just a note that there are now essentially two different capacity estimation tools available in CHIT 2017 with two actually very different goals for them. Next slide. Okay, we have a couple questions. Somebody was asked, there's one question, how long this webinar will go. So this is scheduled till 5. I think the first section on the CHIT portions in particular, we're almost done. Probably another 15 minutes or so. And then we will have time for questions. If there aren't many questions, or no, I'm sorry, then we're going to go into the portion on GFO 15605, and afterwards have questions. We're looking at probably having an hour at the end for questions, so we'll probably be done with actual presentations around 4. And then I actually had a question. Does not consider a drive by users, not in-market users, does it? So actually it can or it cannot. In the annual evaluation, we did actually include the traffic data. So that's essentially the portion that is the drive-by users. So it's all dependent on what you actually use as your inputs for the market evaluation. The way to do the market evaluation in CHIT, and as we discussed in the CHIT Users Guide, is essentially you perform the coverage gap evaluation tool, but you just give it no stations. So basically you evaluate, you find out what the market is everywhere, and without any stations added in, that tells you what the actual base market potential is across the state. And so in 2017, we did include the traffic data. Granted, as I presented earlier, it had a very low weighting, but it is in there in this case, but it doesn't have to be. Users are free to give it a 0 weighting if they want to as well. Okay, so I think the end of this portion of the presentation is just a few notes kind of just for users to be aware of in general. The first is that we've updated the coordinate system for the tool. Back in 2015, CHIT was basically written and provided with all of the data inputs in what is known as, I forgot what WGS stands for, but WGS 1984, whereas now it's in NAD 1983 California Teal Albers. This is part of actually just a broader effort at ARB to be able to start providing all of our GIS tools, all of our GIS data in a standardized coordinate system. It helps people be able to use the data more easily across different platforms and different purposes if they're all standardized in the coordinate system. The actual use of this is transparent to anybody utilizing CHIT. At the end of the day, you can actually do all these calculations with all of the data inputs being in different coordinate systems, and GIS, ArcGIS already has all the routines to automatically handle that, realign everything. It does help have when you have more consistency, it does help reduce the amount of skewing and distortion that can happen because of those processes. But at the level that we talk about, the level that we do evaluations with CHIT, it's really going to be transparent to the user at the end of the day. But again, this is part of an agency-wide effort, so we're going ahead and working with the rest of the agency to try and get our coordinate system on the same basis. So again, this is what all the standard input data from CHIT 2017 will be in. If you have your own data and it's in a different coordinate system, it's still going to work. Just know that if you're looking at ours, it's in this NAD 1983 Teal Albers. Okay, next. We also did make a switch. In 2015, we had essentially a rectangular evaluation grid to now a hexagonal grid. The reasons for this are really pretty detailed. We do cover it in the CHIT Users Guide, actually. There's some documentation, some recommended reading about why hexagonal grids might be actually preferable to rectangular grids and doing geospatial analyses, especially when you're doing aggregations, when you're doing averages within a grid cell, et cetera. Essentially, the hexagonal grid is a little bit more representative. It doesn't have as much skewing in corners because it's more round. And it does tend to essentially have a greater capability of following natural geographic shapes than a rectangular grid does. So these are all admittedly somewhat minor considerations, but it does just help with the overall accuracy and making sure that the tool actually is also following modern standard conventions. A lot of evaluation tools that you'll see out there have moved on from rectangular to hexagonal, so we're following suit. Next slide. Okay, and then we're going to discuss a little bit of the demographic data updates and some of the CVRP results. That's the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project, which is actually the consumer incentive in California, and some of the data we've gotten from there and how that relates to the CHIT evaluation. So next slide. So again, CHIT assesses the first adopter market, and that first adopter market we consider to be represented by multiple demographic indicators. So we use those indicators are things like household income, rates of graduate degree attainment, green vehicle adoption rates, past luxury vehicle adoption rates, MSRP of vehicles sold. The things like income and education come from the U.S. Census Bureau's American Community Survey. So we've updated those to the most recent available for CHIT 2017. The vehicle adoption rates come from DMV historical records. So the luxury vehicles and the MSRP, we've actually updated to the most recent 5 years data, and that matches the time period of the American Community Survey. And then for the green vehicle data, we're in particular looking at PHEV and hybrid vehicles first adopter periods. So in 2015, there was plenty of historical data where you could clearly kind of see the demarcation of the first adopter period for hybrid electric vehicles. So we already had all of that data, but plug-in hybrids were still only a few years old. Now we have more information to fill in that same period for the plug-in hybrids. This is a data set that probably is not actually going to change in the future because we specifically want to look at first adopters of these vehicles, and there's a specific time period that we consider for that, which I believe we've used the first 8 years as that indicator for those two different types of vehicles. Next slide. Now, looking at those demographic indicators, essentially, a lot of prior research into green technology adoption and new technology adoption in general has shown, that these types of indicators are valuable and are reasonable kind of placeholders for actually knowing where the real distribution of adopters are. So a lot of our indicators actually are pretty general for green or new technology adoption. They're not necessarily fuel cell adopters in particular, but we do kind of tailor it as we get information from the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project. So California really, amongst other jurisdictions worldwide, is one of the first places where we're seeing this in real time. We're finally starting to get the information to be able to see what the fuel cell electric vehicle first adopter market looks like in terms of demographic indicators. And so we're looking to the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project to be able to essentially validate the data that we use, the data indicators we use, and their weightings through our CHIT evaluation. As part of this, the project, the people who apply for a rebate are asked to respond to an optional survey. And it's actually a series of optional surveys. The only one that is right now active for fuel cell electric vehicles is the purchase decision survey. So the survey doesn't come right away. Typically, it comes a couple weeks after a purchaser actually puts in their application materials and is approved for the CVRP. So it could be anywhere from a couple months to maybe even half a year before somebody between when somebody purchases a vehicle and they actually fill out the survey. We are in development for the follow-on surveys to get more information from adopters as they actually get more experience with the vehicles and as they have them for years. But right now, the information we do have comes from the purchase decision survey. Next slide. And so this really helps us kind of look at what were some of the motivations and what are the concerns for fuel cell electric vehicle adopters. So the really number one purchase motivator was reducing environmental impacts. In all of these next slides, I'm going to be presenting data from the first set of available information from the fuel cell electric vehicle drivers who have actually applied for a rebate. And the fuel cell electric vehicle is actually chosen with significant amounts of technology cross-shopping. They did actually look at BEVs a lot. They looked at PHEVs and HEV hybrid electric vehicles and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles a lot, but still chose the fuel cell electric vehicle as their preferred vehicle here. Next slide. So CHIT looks at indicators of income and educational attainment, and we can see that first adopters' highest degree attained tends to be postgraduate, so that there's even more actually postgraduate than bachelor's degrees amongst those who have filled out the survey. So that kind of helps us, assess whether or not it's appropriate to keep using that post-secondary degree attainment as an indicator. So far, it seems to be pretty good. It seems to be reasonable. We also look at the number of people within each census tract that are above a certain income level, and that's one of the indicators, at least our spatial distribution. And actually, we're seeing that through the CVRP that income threshold that we have might actually be a little bit too high. We're seeing kind of a double peak here, and with one of the peaks even as low as $150,000 for the household as an income. So we're actually considering whether or not we need to look into retuning the input data for that one indicator. Next slide. As I had mentioned earlier, we look at hybrid and plug-in hybrid in particular, past hybrid and plug-in hybrid electric vehicle adoption rates in particular, but not BEVs, because of the consideration that plug-in hybrids, hybrids, and fuel cells are essentially electrified drivetrains that enable you to drive on a cleaner drivetrain without really having to change your fueling pattern. And we can see here that according to these CVRP respondents, way more of them have had hybrid electric vehicles in the past, but even hybrid and plug-in hybrids are much greater than BEVs, right? Even plug-in hybrids are greater than BEVs, and they've been around for less time than battery electric vehicles have been. So we feel pretty confident that looking at plug-in hybrids and hybrids without BEVs is still pretty valid. And again, it's a similar story if we look at the technology of the vehicle that was actually replaced. If people bought their fuel cell vehicle and that was to replace another vehicle in their garage, of course, gasoline vehicles were the most common, but then after that, hybrid and plug-in hybrid over BEV. So it seems pretty reasonable to use those two instead of the three green vehicles together. Next slide. As I mentioned, there have been indications that we use actually luxury vehicle adoption rates as another indicator through DMV data. This is based on feedback we've gotten from industry stakeholders in the past that there might be kind of an association of new technologies, more highly capable technologies, more technologically advanced vehicles, and luxury brands. So we looked into this. We compared the CVRP data, which it does ask respondents to name all the vehicles in their garage, essentially, at the time that they made their purchase decision. And we compared that to the 2016 California New Car Dealerships Association's vehicle make market share. And we do see maybe a little bit of more affinity towards luxury vehicles through the fuel cell electric vehicle adopter market. But there might be a confounding influence here. If you notice, the most common vehicle from the fuel cell electric vehicle adopters, the most common make is a Lexus, which also is a Toyota, which Toyota has also been releasing or had the greatest amount of announced plans for release of vehicles. So there might be a confounding factor there. Next slide, please. And then really key here is that, again, this coverage principle for CHIT, that we need to place stations near the homes of the or commonly traveled routes of the first adopters. So let's look into what the CVRP data says about that. Next slide. So ownership concerns at the time of adoption, by far, the biggest concern is too few hydrogen stations to accommodate travel needs. When asked to rank their top three choices, it's the top one. It's the top 1 and 2 also, top 1, 2, and 3. Price of both the vehicle and the fuel were actually the next highest concern. And then we ask them where they are most often currently fueling. So again, this is right after they've adopted their vehicle, just their first early months, and near home by far, followed by along their commute, and then on the way to destinations, to frequent destinations, kind of like on the way to errands. So there does seem to be, you know, kind of some, there definitely seems to be some indications here that near home is most important, but along the commute might be just a little bit less important, but still pretty high up there, right? There still seems to be a good amount of data to support that. Next slide. But then there's also looking at the importance of different stations to those first adopters. Again, so looking at the importance of station locations in the purchase decision in particular. So whether or not these stations were considered by those adopters when they made that decision to buy or lease a fuel cell. And again, the near home is the most, that was most commonly selected as extremely important and very important. It seems to be far and away, again, the most important in the purchase decision in particular. And that's what's really important about this top graph. Followed then by along the commute, and then the destinations and vacation, the frequent errands and vacation destinations. And then when asked about the importance of an additional station to allow exclusive use of their fuel cell so that they wouldn't need to rely on a backup gasoline vehicle, for example, or backup hybrid electric vehicle, again, same pattern, near home, then a long commute, and then the other two locations, right? If we go to the next slide. And then, again, when asked for the desirability of a new station in different locations to be ranked 1, 2, 3, and 4 amongst near home, on the way to errands, along the commute, and on the way to or near frequent destinations, we actually do get a little bit of an interesting story here where the commute, or no, where as a top choice, there's actually a lot of desire for stations like connector type of stations, whereas the commute, though, when you look at the top 1 and 2 choice, again, becomes a second only to the near home. And this was the same story across all of the respondents, regardless of where they currently fuel most often. So this figure at the bottom takes all the data from the figure at the top and just splits it out by the groups of where they actually currently fuel. So you can see that there's not a lot of people who currently fuel at vacation destinations, and but you can see their distribution of where they want more stations. But there's, you know, the most people are currently fueling the most near home, and they continue to want more stations the most near home. So no matter where you're fueling now, the most often you still want to fuel near home the most. So this is really providing a lot of strong indications that, you know, the method and the principles in CHIT to look primarily for placing stations near the homes of first adopters, and then to provide some consideration for stations on the way during their commutes is pretty much the way that the first adopters are thinking they need to have the stations themselves. And that's going to help with their purchase decision and actually help get them to adopt that vehicle. Next slide, please. Okay, we've also updated the online viewer. So the next slide. This is really to allow interested parties who don't have access to ArcGIS desktop, because it isn't necessarily a cheap software, to have access at least to the results, to be able to explore where does the state think that the need for new stations lies, what is that coverage gap evaluation, what are those priority areas, what is the local capacity need. So the link to that map is also provided on our infrastructure assessments page. It's essentially the same exact layout as the one that we previously provided in 2015 for the 2015 annual evaluation, and for in 2016 and for the GFO 15605. So if we go to the next slide, just a quick overview. It looks at coverage gap. It provides a new, additional capacity need. Again, it's a full state analysis. There are bookmarks in there to zoom in on areas of interest. And there is some of the data in this. We don't really have the ability to give you all of the input data that is in the CHIT 2017, but it provides all the output, essentially. Next slide. And looking towards the future, so some things that we're working on, first of all, looking at trying to add a scenario analysis tool, so just kind of a what if. So essentially, what if we want to look at the possibility of 2 million vehicles by 2040? What does that look in terms of how can we use CHIT to say where all those stations need to go, right? Very important, we're not developing this as a capability to pick specific locations. Again, the solicitation process is open is intentionally open to provide opportunity for the grant applications or applicants to give information about localized locations and what their findings are. But it's to help us on our analysis needs and some scenario evaluation. And it's all likely to be reported out. Any results that we do report out would be aggregated regionally. We've had conversations about adding yet another redundancy factor to try and determine where additional stations need to be clustered even more than CHIT typically does. I'll just emphasize here that the coverage assessment, again, as you saw at the beginning of this, does already essentially account for redundancy of stations to each other. So this is just something that we've heard some feedback on. We haven't really had a chance to sit down and discuss too much of the details, but we're still looking at it. Implementation of station availability data so that we scale coverage provided by stations according to their availability. If there is a station that is not often available at the peak fueling times, maybe that's an indication that another station needs to be close by in terms of the reliability and the customer experience of what they see as the actual availability of that station. There are some proprietary data concerns around this concept. It's a concept that we've heard of and that has been presented to us, but we haven't necessarily developed this yet. I think there's a lot of discussion that needs to come through for this first before we can actually implement it. And similarly, looking at addition of station throughput data as a way of, as kind of one of those on-the-ground observed data points to determine where new stations need to be placed. Again, this does also have proprietary station data concerns. We have to figure out whether or not, again, that's something that would be able to be shared in something like the open public data platform that CHIT represents. So I think the next slide's the end of it. So this is where the links are for access to the CHIT desktop tool, the 2017 online map viewer, and the 2015 online map viewer is still available. These two links at the bottom are actually also available at the link on the top. So that first link is really your most important one. Seems like, I think, next slide. Yeah, so it looks like there are a few questions left. So there was one question of, is the survey geographically distributed? For example, are different things more important in LA versus Bay Area versus Sacramento? That's actually a really good question that we haven't yet had time to look at. We've kind of been just considering every respondent in aggregate across the state, but I think that's something that we probably really should start looking into, especially as we get more respondents. I forget the date of the data set that we had. I do believe it was still pretty early on. I don't think it represents 1,600 drivers, for example. I think there were, do you remember, Matt, how many, what the end? Yeah, the total number of data points in the CVRP data was something like 250. So we do have to continue looking at that. That's part of the reason why in the 2017 annual evaluation, we presented the data and presented it as early indications, but we weren't using it yet as, to make any decisions about making changes in CHIT because it wasn't a very highly representative data set yet. But as that data set grows, we're gonna more seriously consider making changes to CHIT based on that. Is there a survey of negative experience, feedback, lessons learned? Trying to think. I honestly cannot remember on the spot if there are any questions in that survey about that. But I could get back to you on that and see. I think Also, I do believe that the full survey questions might be posted online by the Center for Sustainability and the Environment. I think they're the ones who actually run the survey itself. So you might want to check with them on what is available. And if not, if any members of the public are interested in understanding more about the questions themselves, feel free to contact me. Yeah, and so so there's a comment that the things that actually positively influence purchase decisions are just as important as the things that actually turn people away. And I agree. I think those are important factors and things we need to consider. I just at the moment don't remember if those are actually in the survey. So I think if anybody has any questions left on the CHIT portion of this webinar, this is the time to ask them. If you want to ask questions by voice, you can actually let us know. Click the little hand raise button and we'll unmute you. Otherwise, if you can type them in. And if not, then we're gonna go ahead and get on with the GFO portion of this. Oh, we have a question in the room. Yeah. Press it for the until it's the screen. 1 second.
Yes, this is Chris Jenks, Energy Commission. I was noticing about the survey where it seemed to indicate that people preferred to have a hydrogen station close to their home rather than along their commute route as their top priority. But it seems to me that it would be more difficult to supply a station for each person's neighborhood than it would be to put a station along most people's commute route. For example, in Sacramento here, there's this interchange where we have 50, 99, 5, and 80 all converging. And it seems like a single station there might serve more people than that same station put in one of the neighborhoods. And I was wondering if maybe maybe that might skew the survey result a bit.
Yeah, so I think one of the things to ask though then is where people, as a gasoline driver, where do you fuel up? Do you fuel while you're still in the middle of your commute most often, or do you actually most likely, fuel at the station that's on, around the corner in your neighborhood on your way to the highway, right? I think there's plenty of data out there. I mean, there's definitely plenty of data that along the highway is a good place to put stations. There's been plenty of studies about that. There's been plenty of, user feedback, including from the natural gas vehicle experience that, that can be a valuable place to put stations. But then at the same time, when you look at the example of how, once you're at this point, granted, we're not there yet, but when you're at this point of gasoline station type coverage, do people really want to fuel most often for their commute right when they're leaving the home or right when they're getting home versus like, okay, I got to stop off on my way to work or on my way back from work in the middle somewhere. There are people for sure, and our survey data is showing that, but I think there's both considerations that have to be there. And I think the other portion of it that's really important for this is that we're looking at that first adopter market. And I don't know how much along the commute is going to influence, how strongly that's going to influence the purchase decision as much as the one near the home. And that's kind of been what we've heard all along from stakeholders about what the consumer is probably going to react to. And that's what we kind of were seeing really with the CVRP data, so especially that one question that was, which one of these influenced your purchase decision the most? And that the near home was so much higher than any of the other locations. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah. So Steve, you're unmuted. Steve, if you're asking your question, we can't hear you.
Oh, sorry, guys. No, I'm unmuted on my phone. Okay. Hey, awesome job. Thanks so much for a great presentation so far. It's just, it's everything you wanted to know about CHIT, and we're not afraid to ask. On the census data, I wanted to ask you a question about it and give you an example. How do you deal with something like this? And that is recent news, and I think it's just been within the last few months, says that, for example, Irvine is the fastest growing city in California. If census data is yesterday, how do you look at, I'll call it today and tomorrow? And some of this is, you can tell by having a connection to a particular market. I mean, literally you see building going on that's been stagnant for the last 10 years or something like that. So just talk about that a little bit. And if in the second part B of that would be, if there was input we wanted to provide and ask you to call it out specifically on some of these type of things, how would you accommodate that? Thanks.
Yeah, so the short answer is that exactly as you noted, census data is really only looking backwards, right? So the short answer is that we don't have another indicator for growth trends or growth rate over the last X number of years localized. I'm aware of that data existing in general. I'll admit I haven't looked at every data source for that. I don't know yet if it's complete essentially across the state, right? So if you're aware of data that's complete across the state, that'd be very valuable for us to use. As I mentioned, we want something that can provide an evaluation equitable anywhere in the state, or even just an evaluation that's equitable in the urban markets or the the high or the markets where we see the vehicles coming out. We just want to avoid anecdotal type of information. So anything that's got that kind of feature to it would be helpful. But just one note is that our census data is the 5-year averages for the last 5 years. So that does include a little bit of, most recent kind of information available. That does also actually help with the statistical significance of that information. We could go to the 1 year, but it'd be less likely to be as accurate as the 5-year data, just because you have a greater sample size with the 5-year aggregates. But yeah, if we had information on growth, I think I've seen information on growth in terms of select high density urban areas for having that, but I'm not really aware yet of something that's more complete than that. But if we could, that'd be great. Even if it does have to kind of consolidate a few resources together, a few data sets together to kind of stitch it all together and get it to work, then we'd definitely be open to that. I think that's a good idea, especially since, as we talked about, a lot of the market indicators are trying to make this prognostication, they're trying to predict things. And as you mentioned, if you can have a little bit more information of where things are going versus just where they are, that can help for sure. So yeah, I'd be interested in understanding those data inputs and what's available. We also have a question typed in on if there was any information on how people learn about fuel cell electric vehicles. This would be important for increasing activities and impactful marketing methods. In terms of this, I assume this is in terms of the CVRP survey. And yes, what I presented today is not at all exhaustive of what the CVRP survey asks for. It does ask where you learned about fuel cell vehicles, what information resources you've used. It asks about the dealer. I believe it asks about the dealership experience and all of that. I only presented a select subset that was most directly associated with the calculations in CHIT today. So there is definitely a lot more information available. And again, we utilize that information across programs, both within ZEV and outside of ZEV, to inform our work here too at CARB more broadly, even outside of just AB8, but in the full ZEV and Advanced Clean Cars program. So. Okay, so I think that looks like it for questions. And I think so I'm going to ask Jane to come up and present on the GFO 15605.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jane Berner. I'm with the Hydrogen Unit in the Fuels and Transportation Division of the California Energy Commission, and I'm going to be giving our next section's presentation here. If anyone is having trouble hearing me, please do write something in the chat box, but hopefully I'm using the microphone correctly. So I'm going to be taking kind of a look backwards now, whereas we just spent the last couple hours looking at the latest developments related to CHIT and the 2017 update. Now we're going to look a little bit backwards about how CHIT was used under the last GFO related to hydrogen refueling infrastructure. That's GFO 15605, which was called Light Duty Vehicle Hydrogen Refueling Infrastructure. And see how CHIT was used and how it was, how other factors were incorporated into this evaluation criteria that was called coverage, capacity, and market viability. So in the next maybe 45 minutes, an hour, somewhere in that amount of time, I hope to accomplish a few things. We're going to review the GFO 15605 evaluation criteria. I'm going to go quickly through all of the criteria. I know it's probably been a while since a lot of people have looked at it, and maybe some of you have never. So I'll quickly cover what was in there in terms of the evaluation criteria, and also spend a couple of minutes looking at the scoring scale that was used by the evaluation team that reviewed applications. But for the most part, we're going to focus on the coverage, capacity, and market viability evaluation criterion, which was just one of the criterion that was used in the GFO. And that's where CHIT was a component, as well as some other factors. So we're going to talk about both how CHIT was used and how other factors, which are really more of the market viability aspect of the criterion, were used in this GFO. And so we're going to review each component, and I'll give some examples of types of information that could have been provided for each, and then we'll have time for comments and questions. And I will try to do the same as Andrew did. If questions come in while I'm talking, I'll try to address them as it fits well. And so at the end of this talk, I hope we'll have accomplished a few things. I hope we'll have kind of come to a common understanding of what the coverage, capacity, and market viability evaluation criterion was all about in GFO 15605. And then I hope we will have had the opportunity to hear a lot of your questions if anything was unclear, and then to start to get feedback about what you liked and did not like about how the evaluation criterion was set up. And so this is all in advance of thinking about the next solicitation or the next ones, either singular or plural, depending on how we end up going. And so I want to start hopefully getting feedback. But I should also say that we have 3 upcoming workshops that the Energy Commission is hosting. They're listed here on this slide. The next one is November 30th, then December 4th, and December 14th. They are all going to be held at the Energy Commission, but they also have webinar components for those who would like to attend remotely. And it's really the December 14th date where this discussion can continue. So if you think of questions later, or if you think of feedback later, there's definitely more time. Do not despair. There will be plenty of time to get your feedback in. And the December 14th date is when all of the evaluation criteria will be discussed, as well as things that were like the critical milestones, the data collection elements of the GFO. And so that will cover any of those topics. Today, though, we want to focus on the specific coverage, capacity, and market viability evaluation criterion. And I also want to note that we have opened a docket. And so the URL of it is listed here on this slide. On this page, you can find the information about those workshops that was just shown in terms of their agendas and information about attending. It's also the place to submit comments electronically. So that's always a good idea in terms of getting your comments on the record for us to consider in the future solicitation development. And that site also lists contact information for staff working on this at the Energy Commission. And it's also a way to, the place to subscribe to the listserv that will give you the information about this activity, the hydrogen units activities. So first I'm going to go over really quickly the overall evaluation criteria that was in GFO 15605. There were 13 different evaluation criteria. So they went from the qualifications of the applicant team. Then the second one listed here is coverage, capacity, and market viability that we'll be talking about today. There was safety planning, project readiness, station operation maintenance, project budget and financial plan, station performance, economic and social benefits, innovation. There were a couple of criteria related to renewable hydrogen, and then sustainability and environmental impacts. So the total points that could be earned under this solicitation were 500, and there's 100 specifically was for coverage, capacity, and market viability. So it was the criteria that offered the most points, 20% of the possible points. And just a reminder that the passing scores was 350 out of 500, or 70%. So that's sort of what the score, what the point was for passing or not passing in this GFO. And then I'm just going to quickly review the scoring scale. So related to that 70%, it sort of shows how the evaluation team reviewed these evaluation criteria and assigned a score that would lead to the possible points that the applicant received. So it ranges from 0 to 100, or 100 to 0, depending on how you like to think of it. And the evaluation team gives scores in increments of 10, so 0, 10, 20, 30, and so on. And you can see that the 70% is sort of that adequate range where, and anything above that is considered, you know, the passing, the good, the excellent, the exceptional responses, and then below that is the non-passing scores. And just to remind folks that people would, the evaluation team members give their own scores of each application, and so they evaluate, is this an adequate response, is it inadequate? And they go through the scale for each of the evaluation criteria for each application. Then the team meets, and there's a the score, a combined score is achieved. So this slide shows 1/2 sort of the scoring scale in more detail. So this is the full scoring scale as it's described in GFO 15605. So it's taken from table 8 for anyone who wants to review it later. But this just shows in more detail sort of what the interpretation means. And so the thing that I wanted to point out particularly here is most of the less successful scores tend to all deal with responses that don't address components of the evaluation criteria. So it's omissions, flaws, or defects, and either not addressing criteria at all, or mostly not. And then once you get to adequate, or 70%, you're pretty much addressing, the applicant would have addressed pretty much all of the evaluation criteria components, and any omissions or flaws are pretty, small or inconsequential. And then once you get above 70%, you're looking at applications that fully responded to all of the evaluation criteria, and then sort of went above and beyond. So they offered, enhanced features, something that went beyond basic expectations, or really an exceptional solution for the 100%. So that's just a review of how applications were reviewed under GFO 15605. I also wanted to share this excerpt from the application manual for GFO 15605 that talks about what the application content should include. And it says applicants should address each evaluation criterion in the solicitation, including all sub-bullets under each criterion, providing sufficient unambiguous detail so that the Energy Commission evaluation team will be able to evaluate the application. Applicants are highly encouraged to use the exact titles from the evaluation criteria as the heading for each response. And if an evaluation criterion does not apply to the proposed project, the applicant should briefly describe why the criterion does not apply. And so I think, what all of this, to me, is sort of focusing on is, what the scoring scale that we just reviewed was sort of talking about. If there's omissions, if sub-bullets or evaluation criteria are not addressed, that's where applications typically are, not able to earn the highest possible points, because there's just simply not a response for the evaluation team to evaluate. So the importance of addressing all sub-bullets under each criterion, I hope, was clear, and that, that's sort of what this text to me is mostly about. Next, I'm going to give a summary slide of what the coverage, capacity, and market viability evaluation criterion included. And so for the list of all the evaluation criteria that I showed already, that included, qualifications of applicant team and financial plan and safety plan, they all had sub-bullets or components or bullet points. I think I use different terminology for saying the same thing, but they all had points underneath the evaluation criteria. And these are the sub-bullets that should have all been addressed in each application. So under coverage, capacity, and market viability specifically, and I should say this was for the main station competition. There was also an I-5 competition, but here I'm focusing on the main station evaluation criterion, and there was a slight difference in the coverage, capacity, and market viability section in particular. But here, looking at the main station competition, there were 9 bullet points under this criterion. 2 of them are related to CHIT, and then the 7 others were not. And so, and I think we're going to talk in a minute about both criteria types, sort of the CHIT and non-CHIT, to talk about them in this way. But I think the ones that were not relevant to CHIT sort of had a similar, they were all sort of trying to get, I think, at the same thing ultimately. And that is, to try to understand how applicants decided how their proposed locations for their stations were the best possible locations. So what was the thought process that applicants went through to think about why their locations would be successful? And furthermore, and then to present that in the application to justify, why state funds would be used to then fund the construction of the station. So it's kind of it's a way for the evaluation team to justify that the applicant, evaluated their possible station locations, and then told us in their application, why it's a good location, why it's going to be successful, why it will be a good investment, and all the things about the location that cannot be described by CHIT. So that last slide just had the very basic summary of what the coverage, capacity, and market viability sub-bullets were. So now I'm actually showing, and going to show over the next 3 slides, I think the full text of the evaluation criterion. So it is a bit wordy, so it fits across several slides. But here they are in full for the first 4, which is that the proposed station location. So, sorry, the applications will be evaluated on the degree to which the proposed station location results in the high CHIT station coverage value and capacity value, being the first 2 bullets. And then the next one's being about the degree to which the proposed station provides refueling service that meets the hydrogen refueling needs for the projected vehicle demand. And the proposed station provides redundancy and backup in a location needing fueling capacity. The next set here, the next 3, are that the proposed station provides refueling service for local fleets as practicable, that the proposed station provides refueling service that is available during peak fueling periods for light-duty vehicles passing the station, and the peak fueling periods for the location do not conflict with timeframes allowed by local ordinances, and that the proposed station meets the needs of a higher average number of fills over a 1 and 12-hour period. And then the last couple, the proposed station provides refueling service for vehicles tested and deployed at automotive parts assembly, testing, distribution, and demonstration facilities, and that the proposed station's refueling service complements the coverage and capacity of the network of existing and planned hydrogen refueling stations and any other new stations proposed for funding by the applicant under the solicitation. And so those were the list of stations that were provided in Table 1 of the GFO 15605 application manual. So I did, again, run through those quickly because we're going to revisit each of them. And we will start with the two bullet points that were the first under this criteria that are related to CHIT. And so they are the CHIT station coverage value and the capacity value. And so this wasn't so these were bullet points that didn't necessarily require any narrative writing on the part of the applicant. They were just basically providing the values that were provided through CHIT. And so applicants provided these in their application, and then Andrew and his associates at CARB confirmed that the values were, that the Energy Commission evaluation team was looking at the right values. And then those values were considered by the evaluation team. And so here I say they were valued qualitatively and independently. And what I mean there is each team member did their own assessment of the CHIT value for coverage and capacity on their own first, and then there was a discussion when the team met. And qualitatively, and I say that because generally the team looked at the values as sort of in sort of groups, so maybe a high, medium, and low type of scenario rather than the strictly quantitative evaluation of, this number is higher than this number, it's necessarily better. That wasn't necessarily the team members' thinking. And so it did tend to be a more qualitative assessment of, the groupings of CHIT values, and if certain ones, really did seem like they offered higher coverage and capacity value than others. And then CARB, as Andrew already talked about, recalculated the CHIT values after each station was selected. So right now, we're going to go back to a few slides that Andrew prepared, and I'm going to turn the microphone back to him to talk a little bit more through this process of how CHIT was used under these two bullet points.
Okay, thanks, Jane. So as Jane was discussing, the CHIT results both through the desktop tool and the online map, they are presented in very high precision. That's partially just to, let everybody know all the entire, calculation step, the entire precision of the outputs generated. So for example, the online map for coverage gap, all values are 0 to 1, and they have a precision of, 1/100th. In the desktop tool, you'll see that, some of the underlying data is all the way out to, I think that's 1e minus 6, right? So even though the data are presented there because that's what the calculated number is, without any rounding or without any changes in that kind of sense, it doesn't necessarily mean that significant differences in values occur at such a high precision. And this is explicitly recognized through a lot of the processes in CHIT, and as Jane was saying, in the method in which CHIT was utilized through the scoring process. So, for example, hotspot analysis and determination of priority areas, and even the cutoff for the visualizations of the CHIT data through the online map. All of those kind of take into consideration, what is really a significant difference between two values? Where is that cutoff? Where is that line between a set of values? To get into the really nitty-gritty details and the mathematics of it for a second, this is informed by what's called the natural breaks method. It's a way to determine the meaningful differences between values in any data set, right? If you've got a distribution of data values, and that's really key to remember here, is that, CHIT has almost 3.5 million values, right? We have 3.5 numbers for coverage or location value, and 3.5 numbers for capacity need. But we have to determine what are those actual differences in there. And so natural breaks is a statistics-based method that minimizes the total variation within ranges. So if you're going to group numbers together, what are the cutoffs so that the variation within each group is the least overall. And so the effect is to identify groups of statistically similar values. And in practice, this essentially tends to break groups or group values that are separated by gaps in the data, and essentially where you have large spread between one data point and the next. Next slide. So during the scoring rounds for 15605, again, the natural breaks classification system was used. And importantly, it was used as an information resource by the evaluation team when they made qualitative assessments of CHIT values. So as Jane said, ARB would run that reassessment tool that we talked about earlier in CHIT, where we add one station and just recalculate everything for the state. And we would recalculate also what are those ranges, what are those natural breaks? Where is it that the data, how do we actually describe the distribution of the data? What's actually a significant difference between location values and between capacity values? And so we provided that information to the Energy Commission in each round. So we provided that description of the distribution. So which ranges were statistically similar to each other, how many of the cells were in each of those ranges so that the Energy Commission scoring team could evaluate for themselves how important even that was at those with those different sizes of those different numbers of location values. And those CHIT ranges and proportions were evaluated on the basis of all evaluation cells across the state. And this was repeated every single round, as it's called a CHIT round on the NOPA. And there was close collaboration between Energy Commission and CARB to make sure that everybody received the same data, make sure that everybody understood what was happening between each round, and so that each of the scoring team members could then take that into consideration and make their own considerations about what that meant for changes in location value or the coverage capacity and market viability score. Next slide. So after every proposed station award was selected, the entire distribution was reevaluated to reflect the changing interpretation of the location values. So just a couple examples here. For example, a location of value of say 0.311, just to pick a random number, may have been more rare and may have been more highly ranked in the distribution after 12 rounds of awards than at the beginning, before any station was awarded, right? Maybe 0.311 was actually really common, and it was kind of low. But after you awarded 14 stations, maybe that was actually pretty rare. I'm not saying that is actually, this is just a illustrative example. In addition, in earlier rounds, a value of 0.311 may have been similar to 0.2 to 0.4 even. Maybe that was the natural breaks, the extent of that group for 0.311. It was in that same, and those values were all statistically similar. But after several awards, the distribution may have shifted such that 0.311 was only similar to 0.282 to 0.333, or it could have shifted the other way. It's not predetermined. It's looking at the distribution of the data after that additional coverage is accounted for by each selected award. And so these data were considered each round by each of the scorers, and they were considered by each scorer independently to adjust their interpretation of what that location value meant. So it wasn't necessarily that, again, 0.310 was less valuable than 0.311. It was each scorer took all of this information into account to determine whether or not that actually was the case. So I'm going to hand it back to Jane now. Continue.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. So I think that hopefully demonstrated, how CHIT was used under GFO 15605 in this evaluation criterion. So that was the 2 of the 9 bullet points that were part of this criterion. And I wanted to show this quote again from the GFO that talked about CHIT's relationship to market viability in general under this evaluation criterion. And so it said, that the Energy Commission evaluation team will score the application using a combination of the CHIT station coverage value, the capacity value, and market viability as part of the one evaluation criterion: coverage, capacity, and market viability. Proposed locations that have low CHIT station coverage and capacity values have the opportunity to document, demonstrate, and bolster the CHIT station coverage and capacity values with the market viability of a proposed station and potentially be successful under the solicitation. And so I think this text was to underscore that, that this evaluation criteria was not only related to the CHIT coverage and capacity values. As I have already said, there were 7 other criteria that were more in the market viability category of this criterion, and that's what we're going to get into now. And really, I think these market viability categories were, again, the way for applicants to talk about how their proposed station location was special, how, while we know that CHIT has a number of data sets and that it helps to evaluate kind of objectively the statewide coverage and capacity need for a location, there are so many particular factors in a particular location that CHIT does not have any idea about, right? There's only a limited number of data sets that it includes. And so this was the opportunity to talk about those local factors that could make this a successful station, even if it had lower CHIT values. So next I'm going to go through each of the remaining sub-bullets under this evaluation criterion and again restate what the bullet point said, and then give some possible responses. And so these are meant to be very generic responses. They're not meant to reflect anything that any actual applicant said, but just ideas for what could have been provided by applicants to provide a response that would have been, responsive to the particular sub-bullet and met that kind of test of was an applicant responsive under, and then could therefore earn more points. So the third bullet point here, to remind folks again, was the proposed station provides refueling service that meets the hydrogen refueling needs for the projected vehicle demand, light-duty vehicle traffic count, and patterns. So thinking about this, I think there could have been a number of factors that applicants could have included in addressing this bullet point. We've already talked about today the CARB ABA annual evaluation and how that includes things like survey results about fuel cell electric vehicle projections and other analyses about what does the early market look like. And so that information could definitely be part of why an applicant thought, oh, this location is a good location. It seems to be responsive to the needs that were identified through these analyses and through these survey results. Another thing that we've talked about is today already, proximity and traffic flow to freeways or major streets. So, maybe an applicant could have said, this location is right at the junction of 2 major freeways, one's north-south and one's east-west, and we can get, commuters going both directions, and so it's really ideal for maximizing, the vehicle demand, and so we think this is going to be a very successful location. An applicant could have talked about how the location serves various origins or destinations, and so maybe it connects points of interest, specific points of interest that things like, again, CHIT cannot possibly know about, but that an applicant can very well know about as they assess locations. And then there's also the possibility of looking at a number of regional or local planning documents that could be relevant to what the question that already came up today was about looking into the future. So rather than just looking at census results from the past, is there a way to assess future need? And so I would say regional transportation plans are one great way to do that an applicant could look. So in our major urban areas, each metropolitan planning organization does a regional transportation plan that typically has a 20 or 30-year time horizon. And so it's trying to look at the number of people that will be in the region in the future and what is the transportation system that will meet the needs of the region. And so you know, and they can get specific in terms of identifying specific needs and specific places within a region. And so showing consistency with that kind of regional vision could, you know, be another way to demonstrate that this location has a particular ability to, you know, meet a projected vehicle demand. There's also always a general plan in any location. So either the city, or if it's an unincorporated area, the county has a general plan, and there's always a land use element to the general plan, and there's always a mobility element. And so a city and county would have, you know, developed policies through those general plans and showing consistency with those plans, such as like the land use of this area is deemed to be commercial, and they specifically want to have vehicle refueling uses in this corridor. You know, there could even be something to that degree that shows that the applicant is aware of the underlying, you know, zoning issues with the location, and that it meets sort of the vision of the local government, which of course could also help with expediting approval of a location. And then the Energy Commission has also funded alternative fuel readiness plans. Sometimes they're under different names like ZEV readiness plans, or I think there's been a few others, and a few of them have focused on hydrogen in particular. But again, a local government or their consultant may have already assessed needs for hydrogen stations in an area, and the applicant could show consistency with that. There's also characteristics of the local areas, employment centers, and so maybe, you know, an applicant could talk about that the demographics of this particular residential area make us think that, you know, there could be a large early adopter market here. So you can do your own information from your own observations, like maybe the applicant could say, every time we visited the site, we see fuel cell electric vehicles driving by. You know, it could be very specific information even about how the applicant came to think that this location was going to be successful, and that it would be in a place where there would be a high potential demand, and that, you know, so there would be a lot of business. And then on this bullet point, again, I wanted to stress that I think input from other stakeholders is also could have been a potential response to this bullet point about hopefully an applicant could have talked with folks such as auto manufacturers or specific dealerships about their thoughts of this particular location, and also the location owner or operator, if it is currently a gas station location, you know, could have talked about what the current market is like, and an applicant could have discussed that. Talked with local governments about the suitability of the station from their perspective, and of course also potentially FCV drivers or prospective drivers. So it could have included, you know, that an applicant reached out to stakeholders to get their own feedback about if a station location would be successful, and then this information could be relayed to the Energy Commission in this evaluation criteria bullet point. All right, so now I'm going to go into the fourth bullet point. Although actually, let me take we do have a request for a short break. I am open to that. Is anyone else? Should we do it? Okay, we will take a we'll say, let's see, I think it's 4 o'clock. So we'll say 4:05, and we might be a couple minutes late, but we'll come back in 5 to 7 minutes. All right. I think we will start again. Hopefully everyone had time to take care of their business. So I'm on the fourth bullet point of the coverage, capacity, and market viability criterion. Before I get into that, I think that the next ones in my mind were a little more specific, so I don't have quite as many, examples of possible responses to go through, so we'll move a little quicker. And so hopefully we'll still have plenty of time for any questions that might be burning. And that's both related to my presentation or Andrew's from earlier. And hopefully what I'm talking about seems pretty obvious. I hope that's the way it is to many folks who are listening. But we wanted to go through this exercise to get everyone's minds refreshed on this evaluation criterion, and then we will with the others at the later workshop, so that we have your minds refreshed about what you thought worked or didn't work about this criterion. And, so this is only, again, looking at the past. Whether or not the next solicitation looks anything like this is to be determined. So that's the type of feedback we will be wanting to get over the next, today and the next workshops and through the docket. So continuing on with the fourth bullet point, the proposed station provides redundancy and backup in a location needing fueling capacity. So in my mind, possible responses here would have been related to, the applicant demonstrating their awareness of the existing network and how their proposed station location would fit into the vision for how the network should operate and how it will evolve to meet the demand for more and more fuel cell electric vehicles. And so applicants' responses could have included discussions of proximity to those nearest funded stations, either open or planned, possibly usage of those nearest stations if the aggregated information from the NREL data collection tool through the consolidated data products, if I'm getting my terminology, if I'm remembering it right, there could be information that the applicant could use about current usage or expected usage of the stations that exist already and what their projections are for their proposed station. And then is the proposed station, near another station that the applicant's proposing. So in terms of if the applicant was proposing multiple stations, do they work together to, improve operational efficiency, or can one back up another or offer redundancy? How do they support each other? And then responses could have also included things like, is the station itself a redundant system? Does it have internal technology that enables it to have redundancy and backup to itself? If part of it were to have a maintenance issue, can it still be functional? The fifth bullet point is the proposed station provides refueling service for local fleets as practicable. And so this bullet point, I think, could have been responded to in a few ways. Of course, if there are identified fleets that an applicant has, talk about what those identified fleets are, the potential in terms of maybe the number of vehicles, the date that their fueling needs are going to be needed, and maybe they offer time of day fueling advantages, so maybe they would all refuel in the middle of the night and not affect the regular commercial market, and would only enhance the success of the station. So there could have been discussion along those lines, and it could have been, again, kind of a gradation of response from we definitely have secured agreements to we're in discussion to we maybe think we don't necessarily need the demand from a fleet, but we do have some identified in case demand from the regular commercial market isn't what we thought. And then, of course, another acceptable answer is that fleets aren't part of an applicant's business model and why that is. And so why this possible response is here is that, again, it is a potentially valid response if it's not, if the applicant has other reasons why it thinks the station will do fine without the added customer base of a particular fleet, then that is an acceptable answer. And I think the lesser answer here would have been to not address the bullet point, because again, going back to the scoring scale and how an evaluation is done on applications, really the point has to be addressed in order to earn, any types of points. So that is, again, the key. Remaining silent on an issue really doesn't give the team any possibility of giving you extra points. And that's something that the team generally looks to do, is to find how the applicant responded to every point and to give them credit whenever possible. All right, moving on to the 6th bullet point. The proposed station provides refueling service that is available during peak fueling periods for light-duty vehicles passing the station. That's daily, weekly, or during other time periods. And the peak fueling periods for the location do not conflict with timeframes allowed by local ordinances. So here, some possible responses could have been related to the minimum technical requirements that the GFO had for peak fueling capacity and how the station location would meet or exceed that minimum, and how that is in line with the expected demand for the particular location. And maybe growing demand over time. So maybe, there's a certain demand expected at the beginning of operations, but then in a few years it would be more. And how is the applicant, addressing that peak fueling period, peak demand growth over time? Another possible type of information to include would have been fuel sales in the local area, or if it's at an existing gas station for that particular station in terms of gasoline and or hydrogen. So again, these would be possible indicators of why an applicant thinks a station will do well in terms of the amount of demand that we'll have at that location. And then, of course, the last point of this bullet was about the time frame allowed by local ordinances. So this is an opportunity for the applicant to describe that they are aware of the hours of operation allowed by the local jurisdiction at this location, and that it is consistent with the planned operations. All right, we have 3 more to go here. The 7th bullet point is about the proposed station, that this proposed station meets the needs of a higher average number of fills over a 1 and 12-hour period. So here, again, the minimum technical requirements were for both daily fueling capacity and peak fueling capacity, and this could have been discussed under this bullet point as well. And again, if it's a location where the applicant felt that, we do expect a lot of demand from the early market in this area, it could include factors such as site design features of the particular location. So maybe there's extra space on the site and capacity could be increased over time. Maybe there are design features about the station, in particular allowing for multiple fueling positions or multiple dispensing systems that again would allow for a higher number of fills over a peak period. And then, added on to those 2 things, can the applicant demonstrate that they actually have proof that they're planning to do this scale up in the future and that they're prepared to do so. And so I think generally the underlying thought here is that there should be an alignment of the proposed station design with the anticipated demand at that location. The 8th bullet point was that the proposed station provides refueling service for vehicles tested and deployed at automotive parts assembly, testing, distribution, and demonstration facilities. So this bullet point, I think, is in some ways similar to the fleets bullet point in that it's sort of looking for if particular factors are sort of in the applicant's plans for how to improve the viability of the station location. So it could be that, co-locating with some type of facility could either increase the throughput at the station and enhance the economic viability of the station in the early years before a larger commercial market has been established, or and it could also potentially have benefits in other ways, like lowering the land rents at the location. If it's on a shared facility. So it was looking to, I think, draw out any types of business agreements or thinking that the applicant might have about how to find these other types of aspects of the station location that would help with its success of the station, not in lieu of the light duty market, but to only enhance the station's success. And of course, serving the light duty market of the commercial market is the main objective. But are there other elements to the station, this particular station, that would enhance its viability? But this could also, I think, have been a bullet point where this simply is not part of the applicant's business model. And then I think, objective would be here for the applicant to have said the reasons why, and why they still think the station location will be successful, why it still has strong market viability. All right, and on to the last bullet point under this evaluation criterion. It says the proposed station's refueling service complements the coverage and capacity of the network of existing and planned hydrogen refueling stations in Table 1 and any other new stations proposed for funding by the applicant under the solicitation. And so again, Table 1 was simply the list of already funded stations from previous grant funding opportunities. And so here I think there could have been a number of responses relating to the coverage and capacity evaluations that are done by both CARB and by the Energy Commission, then the two AB8 reports, the one summer report and the one December report. And so showing consistency and that the applicant's aware of what those analyses said and how they think their station will address those needs would have been something that the applicant could have said here. And also, so that's sort of the government's evaluation of coverage and capacity need, but there's also many other stakeholders, such as the auto manufacturers, local jurisdictions, and on the applicant's own analyses. And of course, we have a lot of applicants with a lot of experience in this field, and so they very well might be relying on their own internal analyses, or they may just have other outside entities that they're aware of that have done analyses that they use. And so, that would have all been good supporting information under this bullet point. And I did want to stress in talking about that, if there are outside analyses or any types of sources that applicant's using to justify any of its thinking, generally in the evaluation and the application process, cite those sources so that the evaluation team can understand what the source is and can, verify it. That only helps strengthen the application. All right, so I have made it through the coverage, capacity, and market viability sub-bullets. So I think, let's see, I think we might have a few questions, but generally now I think we will open it up to comments and questions about CHIT or about the GFO process that does include CHIT, or how how it has been done in GFO 15605, and if anyone has comments about how it should be in the future. Let's see. So there is a question. I think this was the most recent one. I would try to see if there was one above it. For the revised NOPA on November 8th, for the 5 sites identified for funding, how was the list ranked? And so there's a second question of only based on the CHIT 2015 score or by reapplication of all evaluation criteria. So they were ranked by their overall score of the evaluation for all the evaluation criteria. Okay, I will actually add a little bit of extra to that response because I have folks here in the room helping give me some more ideas of what I could say about that. So folks might remember, so again, related to the most recent NOPA, the earlier NOPA had preliminary scores for all stations, so including for the ones that were not funded in the first NOPA. And so the team did, so in the NOPA, the overall score, the overall evaluation team score is what ultimately decided the next selections, but it was basically the CHIT component that was changing as the team revisited and continued to make additional awards. And so that was essentially the factor that changed the overall score for the most part. The other components had been scored already. And again, if we will read comments out of the comment box, but if anyone does prefer to ask a question verbally, we can also respond to you if you raise your hand and we can unmute you.
Okay, so it sounds like, or it seems like there aren't really any more questions now. So I think we're going to go ahead and end this. I want to thank Jane and everybody from the Energy Commission for participating here. If you do have any follow-up questions or follow-up comments, either, I believe contact information is in the slides for myself and for Jane, or for the Energy Commission in general. Or on the docket page. So ARB will be posting the recording of this webinar as well as the slides themselves. So all of the information presented today, including the links to all the various important websites, will be on there, and email contact information as well. So either through the slides or through those websites themselves. So yeah, thank you all for participating today, and we hope to hear back from you and continue the conversation on how we're putting together the 100 stations plus for AB8. Have a good afternoon, everybody. Bye.